My mother shoved the last wedding gift toward my sister's open SUV and said, "The gifts are hers now, don't be selfish." I stared at the boxes filling Brittany's trunk, then at the stack still sitting beside my parents' garage. The night before, those boxes had been on the gift tables at my wedding. They had my name and Nathan's name on them. Some were still wrapped in ivory paper from our registry. Others had cards taped across the top in handwriting I recognized from aunts, cousins, coworkers, and friends. My father stood beside Brittany's car with his arms folded as though he were supervising a perfectly ordinary delivery. Brittany was holding a new set of copper cookware against her hip. Nobody looked embarrassed. Nobody looked confused. The only person acting as if something had gone wrong was me. Before I tell you how my wedding gifts ended up in my sister's SUV, I hope you're doing well today. Stay with me, because what looked like another ugly case of favoritism turned into something much bigger than any of us expected. And if you enjoy stories about families finally facing the consequences of what they do, subscribe to the channel and keep listening. This happened a few months ago, in May, not long after Nathan and I got married outside Columbus. I was 39, old enough to know exactly what belonged to me, and old enough to be deeply tired of being told that asking for basic fairness was somehow evidence of bad character. Nathan and I had spent the morning after our reception at home opening cards, answering messages, and trying to recover from a wedding that had gone well enough that I had finally allowed myself to relax. My parents had volunteered to transport the boxed gifts from the venue because they had 2 larger vehicles and had done the same thing for other family weddings. The planner had our written permission to release the boxes to them after the reception. That was the arrangement. Transport them. Keep them overnight if necessary. Bring them to us. At no point did Nathan or I transfer ownership of anything to my parents, and at no point did either of us tell them they could redistribute our wedding gifts, according to which daughter they thought deserved them more. Nathan was the first person to realize something was wrong. He had been making coffee when he looked at the list we had started from the cards we brought home and asked why none of the larger registry items had arrived. I texted my mother. She answered almost immediately that she and Dad were sorting everything out and that I could come by later. The phrase bothered me. There was nothing to sort. A wedding gift with my name on it did not require a family committee. I called her. She did not answer. I called Dad. He sent me a text that said they were busy helping Brittany. That was when I got in my car. My parents lived less than half an hour away. On the drive over, I told myself I was being dramatic. That was an old habit of mine, one my mother had helped build. Whenever I noticed something unfair before anyone else wanted to admit it, I would spend the next 20 minutes arguing with myself instead of trusting what I had seen. Maybe they were reorganizing the boxes. Maybe Brittany had come over to help. Maybe Dad had used her SUV because it had more room. I could produce a reasonable explanation for almost anything if I worked hard enough. It was one of the reasons I had built a successful career in risk management. It was also one of the reasons my family had gotten away with certain things for far too long. Then I turned into my parents' driveway and saw Brittany's SUV with the rear hatch open. My father was carrying a boxed stand mixer toward it. My mother was standing beside a second pile, reading labels before pointing to either Brittany's vehicle or the garage. Brittany had one of our wedding cards tucked under her arm. There was no confusion left to resolve. They were sorting our wedding gifts. Just not for us. I parked behind Dad's truck so nobody could pretend they had not seen me. "Put that down," I said as I got out. Dad stopped with the stand mixer still in his hands. My mother looked annoyed, not surprised, which told me this conversation had already happened in her head and she had already decided how it was supposed to end. Brittany lowered the cookware slightly. I walked past all 3 of them and looked into her cargo area. There were bath towels, a Dutch oven, 2 boxed lamps, wine glasses, a set of knives, bedding, a coffee machine, several smaller wrapped packages, and at least 3 gift bags I recognized from the reception. Mom sighed. "Lauren, please don't start." "I'm not starting anything, I'm stopping it." I pointed at the mixer in Dad's hands. "That goes back inside. Everything in Brittany's car comes out." Brittany gave a small laugh that sounded more nervous than amused. Mom said you already had most of this stuff. I turned to her. Did I say that? You have a house. That wasn't my question. She shifted the cookware against her hip. You and Nathan already own everything you need. I looked at Mom. Did Nathan agree to give away our wedding gifts? Her mouth tightened. This isn't about Nathan. That sounds like no. Dad finally set the mixer down, but he put it beside Brittany's bumper instead of carrying it back. Don't turn this into a legal deposition, Lauren. I asked a yes or no question. Mom stepped between me and the boxes. Brittany is starting over. She needs help. You have a stable career, Nathan has a good job, and the two of you already have a home. Half these things would just sit in a closet. That was when she pushed another box toward Brittany and said the words I still remember exactly. The gifts are hers now. Don't be selfish. For a second, I did nothing. Not because I was afraid to answer. I was deciding whether anger was going to make the next decision for me. 10 years earlier, I probably would have raised my voice. 15 years earlier, I might have let Mom talk until I doubted myself. At 39, I pulled out my phone. I photographed Brittany's open trunk. Then, I photographed the boxes beside the garage, including their labels. I took a wide shot showing Dad, Mom, Brittany, both vehicles, and the gift pile. Nobody stopped me because they assumed I was being theatrical. Dad even shook his head. Really? Really? I opened a group text with my parents and Nathan and typed slowly enough that there could be no argument later about what I had said. I wrote that Nathan and I had not authorized anyone to give away, open, use, sell, return, exchange, or transfer any wedding gift delivered to us. I wrote that my parents had been authorized only to transport the boxes from the venue. I asked that every item be returned intact. Mom read the message on her phone while I was still standing 10 feet away. This is ridiculous. No, it's clear. Nathan called almost immediately. I stepped a few feet away but kept the family in sight. Are you there? He asked. Yes. Are they actually giving the gifts to Brittany? Yes. There was a pause. Nathan was not a man who raised his voice easily, which was one of the reasons I trusted him. I never agreed to that. I know. Do you want me to come over? I looked at Dad, who was staring at me as though I had turned a private family disagreement into something offensive by documenting it. Mom was whispering to Brittany. No, I said. Stay home. I'll handle this. Nathan hesitated. They're ours, Lauren. You don't have to make this easier for them. I'm not going to. When I hung up, I noticed something near the bottom of the remaining pile. It was an ivory presentation box, smaller than most of the registry gifts and much heavier looking than its size suggested. There was no store logo on it, just a cream envelope secured beneath a thin ribbon. I had seen it once before, late in the reception, when my Uncle Henry had touched my arm near the gift table and nodded toward it. Don't lose the ivory one, he had told me. I had laughed because I was exhausted and assumed he was talking about something sentimental. That sounds ominous. It isn't. He had smiled, but there had been something uncomfortable behind it. The real paperwork is already handled. That's just the part I wanted you to have. Before I could ask what he meant, someone had pulled him into a conversation, and the photographer had called Nathan and me away. I had forgotten about it until that moment in my parents' driveway. I looked at the ivory box. Then I looked at my father. His expression changed so slightly I might have missed it if my job had not trained me to notice people when numbers made them uncomfortable. His shoulders tightened. His eyes moved from me to the box and then immediately back to my face. It was not proof of anything. I knew that. A look was not evidence, and I had spent too many years around corporate disputes to mistake instinct for fact. But it was enough to make me pay attention. I walked toward the box. Mom moved first. Not dramatically. She simply reached down, picked it up, and carried it toward Brittany. What's that one? Brittany asked. Just take it, Mom said. That bothered me more than if she had invented an explanation. I stopped about 6 feet away. Mom, give me the box. She turned. You just said all the gifts were yours. We heard you. I said they belonged to Nathan and me. And I said Brittany needs them more. That box doesn't look like cookware. Mom's eyes narrowed. Why do you suddenly care which box is which? There it was, not an answer, a question designed to make my curiosity sound suspicious. Brittany shifted her weight. Can we please not make this a whole thing? Mom told me you were okay with duplicates going to me. I looked at her. She told you I agreed? Brittany's expression changed. She said you wouldn't care. That is not the same sentence. Mom cut in before Brittany could answer. Oh, for heaven's sake, Lauren, you always do this. You turn every little thing into a principle. I almost laughed. Someone takes my wedding gifts and gives them to another person. And the problem is that I noticed a principle? You know exactly what I mean. I did. I had known what she meant most of my life. When Brittany and I were children and she broke something of mine, Mom told me I was older and should understand. When Brittany forgot money, I was expected to cover her because I was responsible. When she needed help moving, someone asked me because I was organized. If I complained, the same compliment always appeared like a receipt proving why I owed more. You always land on your feet, Mom said. She meant it as praise. She always did. I stared at her and remembered being 16, standing in our kitchen after Brittany had borrowed a jacket without asking and ruined it. Mom had told me the same thing then in slightly different words. You're older. You know better. She's having a hard time. Don't make it worse. The details had changed over the years. The logic had not. Dad stepped forward. Lauren, enough. Your sister has had a rough year. I looked at Brittany. She had ended a long relationship and moved into a townhouse she could barely afford. I knew that. I had even helped her find a moving company when she asked. But need did not create ownership. Her bad year did not erase my name from a gift card. I'm sorry she's had a rough year, I said. Those gifts still aren't hers. Brittany's face hardened. So you want me to give back towels when you already have towels? I want you to give back things that were never yours. That's so petty. No, petty would be arguing over which color towels you took. I'm telling you the whole pile goes back. Mom made an irritated sound and put the ivory box into Brittany's arms. Dad watched me again, and that was the moment my instincts stopped arguing with each other. I still did not know what was inside that box. I did not know why Henry had called it paperwork, or why Dad suddenly seemed more interested in my reaction than in the stand mixer he had been carrying. I only knew 3 things. Henry had specifically warned me not to lose it. Dad had reacted when I noticed it. Mom had just handed it to Brittany without even pretending it was something she needed for her townhouse. I could have taken it back. Brittany was standing right in front of me. I could have reached for it, and if anyone tried to stop me, Nathan and I had already documented that we had not consented to any of this. But another thought stopped me. Henry had said the real paperwork was already handled. If the box mattered to my parents, I wanted to know why. And if they believed taking it away from me accomplished something, I wanted to see what they did once they thought they had succeeded. That did not mean I surrendered the gifts. Before I left, I photographed every box I could see, asked Brittany one last time to remove our property from her vehicle, and repeated in writing that I expected everything returned. She refused. Mom told me I was embarrassing myself. Dad said we would talk when I calmed down, which was almost funny considering I was the only person there creating a record instead of making up rules in a driveway. Then I pointed at the ivory box in Brittany's arms. If you're taking everything anyway, make sure she opens that one first. Mom stared at me. Brittany laughed. Dad did not. I went home without the gifts. That part still irritated Nathan. More than it irritated me because he thought I should have called someone that afternoon and forced the issue immediately. I told him I was not letting it go. I was choosing not to create a physical fight over boxes when I already had photographs, written objections, and one very strange question I wanted answered. He knew me well enough to understand the difference. For the next 2 days, nothing happened. Mom ignored my demand that the gifts be returned. Brittany did not answer when I asked for an inventory of what she had taken. Dad sent one text saying we would discuss it as a family, which usually meant everyone would sit in the same room until I was tired enough to accept a compromise I had never agreed to. I did not respond. On the second evening, Nathan and I were eating dinner when my phone began vibrating across the table. Once. Twice. Then so many times that Nathan looked up. "Family chat?" he asked. I picked up the phone. Brittany had posted a photograph. The ivory box was open on her kitchen counter. The ribbon had been tossed aside. Inside was a cream folder, a letter bearing Henry's name, and what looked like an old-fashioned stock certificate. Brittany had added a caption about getting the best wedding gift after all. I enlarged the picture. My name was printed across the certificate. Lauren Whitmore. Before I could type a word, my Uncle Henry replied to the family group chat. "Why does Brittany have Lauren's shares?" My Uncle Henry's message sat beneath Brittany's photo for less than 10 seconds before the family group chat started moving so fast I could barely read it. One cousin asked what shares he meant. My aunt wanted to know why my name was printed across the certificate if Brittany thought the gift was hers. Someone else sent 3 question marks. Brittany deleted the caption she had written under the photo, but the picture stayed. My mother was the first person from my immediate family to answer. "Everyone needs to calm down. It's just a paper certificate." Dad followed almost immediately. "This is a company matter. Stop discussing it here." That was the moment I stopped looking at the document in Brittany's kitchen and started looking at my parents' reactions instead. Nathan moved his plate aside and leaned closer while I took screenshots. "Do you know what this is?" "No, but Henry does." "Yes." I saved the original image Brittany had posted, every message surrounding it, and the timestamps. I had learned years earlier that people became very creative about what they had or had not said once a conversation became uncomfortable. Then I called Henry. He answered on the second ring. "Lauren, what did you give me?" For a moment all I heard was him exhaling. I assume Brittany opened the box. She posted it to the family chat. I saw. "What shares?" Nathan stayed across the table, quiet enough that I almost forgot he was there. Henry said, 12% of Whitmore Home Group. I looked at the photograph on my screen again. "You gave me 12% of the company as a wedding gift?" "Yes." "You might want to explain that from the beginning." Henry had been my father's business partner for more than 3 decades. He was also Dad's older brother, which meant their professional disagreements could become family history before anyone admitted they were arguments. Whitmore Home Group had started as a single kitchen and bath showroom outside Columbus and grown into 4 showrooms, a warehouse, and a corporate office. I had worked there in my 20s before leaving for a career of my own. Brittany had stayed and climbed into management. I had assumed that meant whatever happened inside the company was no longer my problem. Henry told me the shares had come entirely from his own holdings. He had owned 38% before the transfer and now held 26%. Dad still held 38%. The remaining shares belonged to an employee ownership trust and 2 older passive investors who had been involved in the company's expansion years earlier. Henry had completed the transfer several business days before the wedding. The corporate secretary had updated the stock ledger 3 days before Nathan and I got married. I interrupted him. "Updated it with what?" "Your name. So the paper Brittany is holding is ceremonial." I stared at the screen. Henry continued. "The shares are book entry. Ownership is reflected on the company's stock ledger. That certificate was something I had prepared for you to keep. The letter in the box explains the transfer and gives you the contact information for corporate counsel." I remembered him standing beside the gift table at the reception, telling me the real paperwork was already handled. At the time, I had assumed he meant some legal document connected to the gift. Technically, I had been right. I just had not imagined the document concerned part ownership of the company my father had spent my entire childhood treating like another member of the family. "Did Dad know?" I asked. Henry went quiet again. That silence told me the answer before he spoke. "Yes." Nathan looked up. I sat straighter. "He knew you were considering it?" "No." "He knew the transfer had been completed." That changed the temperature of the room. "How?" The corporate secretary sent the required notice when the ledger was updated. David received it in his capacity as CEO and director. I thought about Dad standing in the driveway while my mother carried the ivory box toward Brittany. The tiny shift in his expression when I noticed it no longer felt quite as ambiguous. Then why would he care about the box if he knew taking it wouldn't change the transfer? I can't tell you what David was thinking. That answer actually made me trust Henry more. He did not pretend to know what he could not know. I asked, "Did he know I knew?" "No. I told him I planned to explain the gift to you at the wedding. I thought he would be angry with me, not you. You told him that? Yes. I closed my eyes for a second. So he knew the transfer was done. He knew you were going to tell me. And he knew the explanation was in that box. Yes. That's information you probably should have started with. I know. I was angry with my parents, but a separate irritation was beginning to form around Henry. Why didn't you just tell me before the wedding? I didn't want to turn your wedding into a corporate meeting. You gave me 12% of a closely held company. I understand how that sounds. It sounds like a corporate meeting would have been useful. Nathan rubbed his thumb along the edge of his glass, clearly trying not to smile. Henry did not. I wanted it to be a gift, he said, not an obligation. Those are not mutually exclusive when the gift has voting rights. I know that now. There was enough self-awareness in his voice that I left the argument there for the moment. I had a more important question. Can Dad undo it? No. Can you? Not unilaterally. Can Brittany do anything because she has the certificate? No. The answer was so simple I almost laughed. All afternoon, my parents had treated that ivory box like something they could physically remove from me. Brittany had carried it away, believing she had acquired whatever was inside simply because Mom handed it to her. But the actual ownership had already been recorded somewhere. None of them could stuff into an SUV. I asked Henry to send me copies of anything I was legally entitled to receive as the new shareholder, but I made one thing clear. Don't summarize it for me. Send me the documents. That sounds like you. I don't know if that's a compliment. It usually is. After we hung up, Nathan asked, "How angry are you?" I haven't decided yet. That isn't what I asked. I looked again at the family chat. Dad had posted another message telling everyone to stop speculating. Mom had sent me a private text saying, "Please do not let Henry drag you into one of his arguments with your father." Brittany had not said anything since deleting her caption. I put the phone down. I'm more interested in why Dad cared so much about whether I knew. Nathan nodded toward the dining room counter, where we had stacked the wedding cards we had brought home ourselves. And the gifts? I glanced at them. I haven't forgotten. You just said you own 12% of a company. I'm checking. I understood what he meant. My brain had already begun reorganizing the problem. The cookware, towels, gift cards, and boxes suddenly felt small next to stock ownership and corporate governance. That was exactly how I handled unpleasant things. I found the largest problem in the room and gave it all my attention. Smaller injuries became irrelevant because they were inefficient. Nathan knew that about me. The gifts are still ours, he said. This being bigger doesn't make that smaller. I know. Good. There was no lecture after that. He went back to eating while I stared at the photo of the certificate. The next morning, I received an email from corporate counsel. Henry had copied me on the introduction, but I replied directly and asked for confirmation of my ownership status without assuming Henry's explanation was enough. That was not distrust. It was procedure. If I was going to make decisions based on this transfer, I wanted the source that actually maintained the company's legal records. The attorney sent me a formal confirmation, the relevant stock ledger extract, and the section of the shareholder agreement governing permitted family transfers. The transfer had been executed correctly. Henry's shares were his to give. A transfer to an adult family member within the defined class did not trigger the company's right of first refusal. The corporate secretary had received Henry's signed instruction and entered the transfer before the wedding. My 12% existed whether the ivory box was in my kitchen, Brittany's townhouse, or the bottom of a river. I printed the ledger page because there was something grounding about seeing my name in black and white. Whitmore, Lauren, 12%. I had spent almost a decade making sure my professional life did not depend on my father. And 3 days before my wedding, I had quietly become one of his company's shareholders. The shareholder agreement was less dramatic, but more useful. It did not give me unrestricted access to every document in the company. It did give shareholders above a certain threshold access to annual financial statements, quarterly management reports, the shareholder ledger, material related party transaction disclosures, and inspection rights for a proper business purpose. I read that section twice. Nathan found me at the kitchen island with printed pages spread around me. You look happy. I'm not happy. You look like you found a rule. That's different. He sat beside me. I explained the basics. Dad remained the largest single shareholder at 38%, but he did not own a majority. Henry had 26. I had 12. The employee trust had 14, and the remaining 10 was split between two passive legacy investors. There was also a 5-person board. Dad had a seat. Henry had a seat. The other 3 were not controlled by Dad. So you can't walk in and fire him, Nathan said. No. Can he fire you? I don't work there. That sounds useful. It is. I should probably explain why that mattered to me more than the shares themselves. I had worked at Whitmore Home Group from my early 20s until just before I turned 30. I had never been glamorous there. I was good at inventory systems, supplier terms, cost control, and finding the boring places where money quietly leaked. Dad used to say I was excellent with processes and terrible with people, which was his polite way of telling me I asked questions he did not enjoy answering. Brittany joined later and was better at making people feel important. Dad called that leadership. Eventually I left because I was tired of being treated like the difficult daughter every time I wanted a number to match another number. I built a career elsewhere. I became a senior risk manager for a logistics company. I made good money. I liked my work. I stopped needing my father's approval so completely that I had convinced myself I no longer wanted it. That belief had worked for years. Then my parents gave away my wedding gifts, and my uncle handed me 12% of the company I had deliberately left behind. I did not immediately demand records. First, I called Henry again. Why me? He knew what I meant. Because I wanted the shares to go to someone who would take ownership seriously. You have other options. Yes. Brittany works there. Yes. There was a pause. I said, that answer was louder than you think. Henry sighed. I'm not asking you to run the company. Then what are you asking? Nothing. I did not believe him. People rarely transferred a meaningful stake in a private company for no reason, even when they called it a gift. Henry might not have had a plan for me, but he had a reason. Those were different things. He added, I've been concerned about how informal some decisions have become. What decisions? I don't want to prejudice you. Henry, David and I disagree about controls. That's all I'm comfortable saying until you've seen what you're entitled to see. That irritated me again, but it was also the correct answer. If he had launched into accusations without documentation, I would have trusted him less. I ended the call with one new fact and several new questions. That afternoon, Dad called. He did not mention the wedding gifts. He did not apologize. He opened with, Henry had no business involving you in this. I leaned back in my office chair. Involving me in owning shares he legally transferred to me? You know what I mean. I actually don't. Lauren, you left this company years ago. Yes. You built your own career. Yes. And now Henry wants to drag you back because he and I disagree about management. That sounds like an issue between you and Henry. It becomes your issue when he puts your name on stock. My name is on the stock ledger, Dad, not just the certificate. Silence. It was short, but I heard it. You spoke to counsel, he said. That surprises you? No, it did. I knew my father well enough to hear the difference between his words and his reaction. I asked, why did you take the ivory box? We didn't take the ivory box. You took every wedding gift, including that one. Your mother was helping Brittany. With a stock certificate? It's paper, Lauren. So why did it need to go to Brittany? Dad's voice hardened. Stop turning this into something it isn't. I almost smiled because it was the same sentence my mother had used in different forms my entire life. Whenever the facts became inconvenient, my reaction became the real problem. What is it then? A family misunderstanding that Henry has now complicated with a business issue. You knew the transfer had already happened before the wedding. Another silence. I receive a lot of corporate notices. That one moved 12% of voting shares, which doesn't make you an expert on the company. There it was. Not denial. A change of battlefield. I never said it did. Good. Because you haven't been involved in years. You don't know our current debt structure. You don't know what expansion costs. You don't know what Brittany handles. You don't know what your uncle has been pushing. I let him finish. Then I said, I know 12% of the company belongs to me. On paper. No. On the ledger. That irritated him enough that his breathing changed. I continued. And I know you knew about the transfer before Mom put the certificate in Brittany's car. You're imagining motives. Maybe. That's why I'm asking questions. Sometimes questions create problems that weren't there before. I wrote that sentence down after the call, not because it proved anything, because it told me what kind of conversation I was having. I still did not know whether my parents had taken all the wedding gifts specifically to hide the ivory box. I suspected it. The timing fit. Dad knew the transfer was complete. He knew Henry intended to explain it at the wedding. Mom had taken the box the moment I showed interest in it. But suspicion was not evidence, and I refused to turn a theory into fact just because it made my parents look worse. So I did something much less satisfying than accusing them. I requested records. My first request was deliberately narrow. I asked for the annual financial statements, the most recent quarterly management report, the current shareholder ledger, and the disclosure schedule for material-related party transactions available to a shareholder at my ownership level. I cited the relevant section of the agreement and stated that I wanted to understand the company's current financial position and the value and obligations associated with my ownership. Nothing inflammatory. Nothing about fraud. Nothing about Brittany. Nothing about my parents stealing wedding gifts. The response took several days. During that time, Mom called twice and left messages telling me not to punish the whole family because Henry was angry with Dad. Brittany texted me that the boxes were safe, which was not the same thing as returning them. I replied once with the written demand I had already made. She sent back, "You're seriously doing all this over gifts?" I did not answer. Nathan read the text over my shoulder. "She thinks this is about towels. She may actually believe that. Do you?" No. By then I knew the wedding gifts were not the whole story. I just did not know how much larger the story was. The documents arrived on a Thursday afternoon through a secure portal. I downloaded them after work and spent the evening reading from the beginning instead of searching Brittany's name. I did not want confirmation bias. If I started with the assumption that my sister was the problem, I would find exactly what I was looking for and miss everything else. For the first hour, nothing stood out. Revenue looked broadly consistent with what I would have expected for a company that size. Margins had tightened. Inventory carrying costs had increased. There had been showroom renovation expenses and a modest increase in marketing spend. Debt was meaningful but not catastrophic. None of it screamed crisis. I was almost relieved. Maybe Henry and Dad were simply fighting over management style. Maybe the wedding gifts were exactly what my mother claimed, a grotesque family boundary violation that happened to collide with an unrelated corporate gift. Then I reached a schedule of project and promotional expenses. One line read, "Showcase Residence Installation." The amount was large enough to catch my eye, but not large enough to transform the company's financial statements. Beside it was an internal project identifier and a name, Brittany Whitmore. I leaned closer. The address was partially listed in the supporting schedule. I knew it. Immediately. I had helped Brittany find a moving company for that address less than a month earlier. It was her townhouse. I stared at Brittany's townhouse address for so long that the numbers stopped looking like an address and started looking like an accusation. The supporting schedule called it a showcase residence installation. The project code was real. The vendor payments were real. The accounting category was real. The only problem was that I had been inside that townhouse. I had stood in the entryway while Brittany complained about the previous owner's tile. I had watched movers carry her sofa through the front door. There had been no public design event, no customer tour, no brand launch, and no sign that Whitmore Home Group was using the property as anything except my sister's home. I did not call Dad. That was the first decision I made correctly. A younger version of me would have reached for the phone because the contradiction looked obvious. I had an address, a project label, and a sister living in the property, but my job had taught me that obvious was not the same as complete. Companies sometimes used executive homes for promotional installations. Vendors sometimes provided products at reduced cost in exchange for photography. Tax treatment, compensation policies, board approval, and disclosure could turn something that looked improper into something entirely legitimate. I was angry enough with my family that I no longer trusted my first conclusion simply because it was satisfying. So I started with the things I could verify. The management report described the project as a residential showcase used to demonstrate premium cabinetry, fixtures, and interior packages to selected clients and referral partners. I searched the company website. Nothing. I checked archived promotional pages available through ordinary public sources. Nothing. I searched the company's social media accounts for Brittany's address, the project name, and photographs I recognized from the townhouse. Nothing. I checked the quarterly marketing summary that had been included in my shareholder materials. It listed showroom events, designer lunches, trade partnerships, and seasonal promotions. The showcase residence was not mentioned once. That still did not prove wrongdoing. It proved the description was worth testing. I opened a spreadsheet. Nathan walked into the kitchen sometime after 10 and stopped when he saw my laptop, printed statements, and legal pad covering half the table. You built another one. I built one. How many tabs? 4. That qualifies as another one. I ignored him and added a column titled Business Purpose. Another for beneficiary. Another for approver. A 4th for supporting material. Nathan looked over my shoulder. What are you doing? Trying not to accuse anyone before I know what I'm looking at. That sounds healthy. It's not emotional growth, it's risk control. That sounds more like you. I showed him the line for the townhouse. He read it twice. Could this actually be legitimate? Yes. Do you think it is? I think I don't know yet. That answer frustrated me more than certainty would have. The next morning I went through the financial materials again, this time not searching only for Brittany's name. I searched for patterns in categories that could hide personal benefits without looking unusual on a summary statement. Vehicle expenses, client hospitality, product staging, promotional travel, interior installation, consulting, executive support. Several items were unremarkable. Then I found a vehicle lease allocated partly to field marketing. The description did not name Brittany, but the internal vehicle number matched an SUV I had seen her drive to my parents' house more than once. A company vehicle assigned to a senior employee was not inherently suspicious. Plenty of executives used company cars. I added it to the spreadsheet but marked it yellow rather than red. Then there was a furniture staging expense billed through a vendor I recognized from one of Whitmore Home Group's showroom projects. Again, not automatically wrong. Brittany worked in brand development. If her home had legitimately been used for promotional photography, furniture staging might make sense. Then I found travel. 3 trips classified as supplier development. 2 appeared ordinary. The third included a luxury resort in Arizona. I remembered seeing Brittany post photographs from that trip. Poolside drinks, a spa robe, a sunset dinner. Her caption had called it a much-needed reset after a terrible year. He sat back. A personal social media caption did not override an expense report. She could have attended supplier meetings and relaxed afterward. I marked that one yellow too. By noon, my spreadsheet looked less like evidence and more like a warning system. Most rows were yellow. A few were green. None were red. That was useful. It meant I had not yet allowed myself to turn suspicion into a verdict. The next question was process. Who approved these things? The supporting schedules were incomplete, but enough names appeared to show a pattern. Some expenses had ordinary department approvals. Others went through Susan in finance. A smaller group showed executive override or exception language. Those were the rows that interested me. The townhouse appeared in that group. So did the SUV. So did a consulting vendor called Northline Creative. Northline had received regular payments over the previous year. None was enormous. That was almost more interesting than one giant invoice would have been. Large frauds attract attention. Repeated moderate charges can become invisible because each one looks survivable. I pulled every Northline entry I could find in the materials available to me. Brand positioning consultation, regional campaign support, client engagement strategy, content development. No detailed deliverables were attached. Again, that was not proof of anything, but it was familiar. My entire career had trained me to notice situations where the paperwork said enough to get through a review without saying enough to tell you what actually happened. I added Northline to the spreadsheet. That afternoon, I called Diane. I had not spoken to her in more than a year. She managed warehouse operations for Whitmore Home Group and had been there almost as long as Henry. When I was 24 and still convinced competence alone could solve office politics, Diane had been the person who taught me which warehouse reports mattered and which reports existed only because someone upstairs liked looking at them. She answered with, "Lauren Whitmore. Either somebody died or somebody broke inventory." Neither. Then I'm disappointed. I smiled despite myself. "Do you have 10 minutes? For you, yes. I need to ask something, but I don't want you sending me anything or telling me anything you're not allowed to share." That sounds ominous. It's actually the opposite. I explained that Henry had transferred shares to me and that I was reviewing materials available to me as a shareholder. Diane whistled softly. David must be thrilled. I haven't noticed much joy. That was sarcasm. I know. I asked whether operational approval processes had changed much since I left. Diane became more careful. Changed how? More exceptions. More projects bypassing normal review. More expenses being coded through brand or executive categories. There was a pause long enough that I could hear warehouse noise behind her. Finally, she said, "You're asking because you already saw something." I saw enough to ask. "That's the right order." I waited, she said. "The company still has processes. They just don't always apply evenly." What does that mean? It means if warehouse wants to move $5,000 of equipment without the right authorization, I get 3 emails and a phone call. If something is labeled executive marketing, sometimes it's already approved before anybody downstairs sees it. Who approves it? Depends. Diane, I'm not naming people based on something I can't document for you. That was exactly why I had called her. Fair. She lowered her voice. What I can tell you is that staff started hearing the phrase family account a lot more over the last 2 years. What does that mean? It means somebody asks why a charge looks strange and somebody higher up says not to worry about it because it's family business. Who says it? Different people. Brittany? Sometimes. Mom? Sometimes. Dad? Sometimes he doesn't have to say anything. I wrote that down but did not treat it as evidence. Diane was giving me context, not documents. She continued. There's also been more pressure to code first and ask questions later. Most of the amounts aren't huge. That's probably why nobody wants a war over them. Does any of it threaten operations? Not by itself. That's important. Yes. I asked about the townhouse. She hesitated. I know materials were delivered there. For a showcase? That's what the project code said. Did warehouse staff treat it like a customer or showroom project? No. What did they treat it like? Brittany's house. That was the first statement that made me put my pen down. Did you ever see an event schedule? No. Client list? No. Marketing photography request? No. Could those have existed without coming through you? Yes. I appreciated that answer too. Diane could have turned herself into my perfect witness. Instead, she kept drawing the line between what she knew and what she assumed. Before we hung up, she said, "Lauren?" "Yes?" I wondered how long it would take before somebody finally asked why the numbers stopped making sense. The sentence stayed with me. Not because it proved my parents had done anything criminal, because it told me the inconsistency had been visible before I arrived. After that call, I found myself thinking about the years I had spent inside Whitmore Home Group. Dad liked telling people I had never fit the family business. That story was clean and convenient. Lauren was too rigid. Lauren did not like sales culture. Lauren wanted something more corporate. Lauren left because she was ambitious. None of those things were entirely false. They were just incomplete. I had been good there. That was the part he rarely mentioned. I had redesigned inventory controls for one showroom before I was 26. I had caught a supplier pricing error that saved the company enough money to fund a warehouse equipment upgrade. I had pushed for approval thresholds because I hated discovering after the fact that 3 departments had authorized the same expense in 3 different ways. Dad praised results when they saved him money. He resented the questions that produced them. Brittany arrived later and had a different talent. She could walk into a room full of designers and make each person feel as if the conversation mattered specifically to them. Customers liked her. Vendors remembered her. Dad loved that. He called it instinct. I called it useful. The conflict came when Dad started treating different skills as different levels of loyalty. If Brittany bent a process to make a client happy, she was flexible. If I asked why the process had been bent, I was difficult. If she needed an exception, there was always context. If I wanted consistency, I was making things personal. By the time I left, I had convinced myself I did not care. That had been one of my more successful lies. I cared enough to build a career somewhere else. I cared enough to become very good at the exact kind of work Dad had treated as an inconvenience. And sitting at my kitchen table 9 years later, looking at rows of expenses tied to my sister, I realized part of me had always wanted proof that I had not been unreasonable back then. That realization made me more cautious, not less. Wanting to be right was dangerous. So I kept checking. I looked into Northline Creative, only through public information and the materials properly available to me. The company had existed for a little over 2 years. Its website was thin, a few generic portfolio claims. No substantial case studies. No staff page. The registered business information had changed addresses once. The current address meant nothing to me. The prior mailing address did. I had seen it before. It belonged to a condo complex where Brittany's boyfriend had lived before moving in with her briefly. His name was Evan Mercer. I did not jump to a conclusion. A shared address could mean coincidence, subleasing, a former office, or any number of ordinary explanations. I checked public business records again. Northline's listed principal was not Evan himself, but a man with the same last name. Mercer. That narrowed coincidence without eliminating it. I searched social media. One photograph from more than a year earlier showed Brittany at a restaurant with Evan and another man I recognized from the Northline website. The caption called him Evan's brother. That was enough for a question, not an accusation. I added a new column to my spreadsheet. Related party? Northline got a question mark. That evening, Nathan found me printing another stack of documents. You've moved from 4 tabs to 7. 6. I counted. 1 is notes. That is still a tab. I slid the Northline information toward him. He read it carefully. So your sister's boyfriend's brother may own a company getting paid by your father's company. Yes. That sounds bad. It sounds like a relationship that should have been disclosed if Brittany had influence over the contract. Was it? I don't know. Can you ask? That's the next step. Nathan leaned against the counter. And the wedding gifts? I gave him a look. I'm checking. I sent another demand yesterday. Response? Mom said she wants everyone to calm down. Nathan laughed once. That family uses calm down like other people use no. He was right. Brittany had also sent me a photograph of several boxes stacked inside her spare bedroom, as if proving she had not burned them should satisfy me. The ivory box was not visible. I asked for it specifically. She did not answer. By then, I had developed a working theory that made me uncomfortable. My parents had not needed the ivory certificate to change ownership. Dad knew that. He also knew I had not been briefed on the transfer before the wedding. If the explanatory letter disappeared into a pile of gifts being given to Brittany, maybe he thought he could delay me long enough to pressure me, or make the whole thing feel like a mistake before I understood what rights I had. But I still did not have proof that taking every wedding gift had been camouflage for taking 1 box. I wrote the theory on a yellow legal pad and underlined 1 word. Theory. Then I moved on. The next morning, I drafted a second records request. This one was more specific than the first because now I had a proper business purpose I could articulate without theatrics. I wanted to understand material related party transactions, executive benefit classifications, vendor approval procedures, and supporting schedules for certain expenses that appeared to benefit a current executive or a potentially related vendor. I did not ask for every email in the company. I did not demand bank statements. I did not accuse my father of fraud. I asked for records tied to categories I had already found in materials I was entitled to review. Before sending it, I asked corporate counsel whether the scope was consistent with the shareholder agreement. The attorney replied that it was appropriately framed and that some items might require board or company review before production. That was fine. I sent it. Dad called less than 20 minutes later. That was faster than the company had answered any formal request. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Reviewing my investment." "Don't play games." "I'm not." "You're turning this into an audit." "No." "I'm asking about transactions already reflected in reports I received. You don't understand how family companies operate. I understand disclosure. You understand policies written for companies 10 times our size." I looked at the request open on my screen. "Is Northline Creative a related party?" Silence. "Not long." "Enough," Dad said. "Why are you asking about Northline?" "Because that's what people do when they see a vendor relationship they don't understand. It's a legitimate marketing vendor." "I didn't say it wasn't." "Then stop implying something." "I asked whether it's a related party." "Talk to counsel." "I already did." His voice changed. Not louder, colder. "You really want to do this?" "I want accurate information about a company I own part of." "You didn't build Whitmore Home Group." "I never said I did." "You left." "Yes. And now you think a few pages of reports make you qualified to judge decisions made by people who stayed." That sentence hit closer to the bone than I wanted him to know. I kept my voice even. "If the decisions are legitimate, the records will show that." "You still think records tell you everything?" "No. But they usually tell me where to ask the next question." Dad ended the call without saying goodbye. I sat there for several minutes after the line went dead. Part of me felt triumphant because he had reacted exactly like someone who did not want questions. That was the part I distrusted. A defensive reaction was not evidence either. I went back to the documents. 3 days passed before anything new arrived. The company did not produce the full second request immediately. Instead, I received a short email from Dad's assistant, asking me to attend a private meeting the following week. Subject line: Confidential ownership discussion. Attached was a document labeled Proposed Redemption. I opened it. The cover letter was polite, almost concerned. It said the company was entering a more complicated operating period, that current debt and expansion commitments created uncertainty, and that a shareholder who was not actively involved in management might prefer liquidity rather than remaining exposed to fluctuations in value and a potentially prolonged governance dispute. There was no claim that I would personally owe company debts. That would have been absurd. And Dad knew I would recognize it. The pressure was subtler. My shares could lose value. Distributions could shrink. Legal fees could grow if conflict continued. The company was willing to propose buying my 12% back, subject to board approval. I turned to the valuation page. Then I read it again. The number was not ridiculous. That was what bothered me. It was low enough to make me suspicious, but professional enough that I could not dismiss it without understanding how they had reached it. I kept reading until I reached the forecast attached to the proposal. Revenue pressure, margin compression, debt burden, expansion risk. A pessimistic picture of the same company whose public-facing materials had spent the previous year talking about growth. I leaned back in my chair. For the first time since Brittany had opened the ivory box, my father was not simply telling me to stop asking questions. He was offering to pay me to leave. And I needed to know why. The meeting was scheduled for Tuesday at 10 in the morning in the conference room beside my father's office. I had spent the weekend preparing for it as if I were walking into a formal review, which, in retrospect, was my first mistake. I had built a clean list of every transaction that bothered me. Brittany's townhouse project, the SUV lease, the Arizona trip, Northline Creative. I had the dates, the categories, the approvers, and the supporting documents I had received. I thought if I presented the inconsistencies clearly enough, the inconsistencies would force everyone in the room to behave rationally. That assumption had served me well in my career. It had never served me particularly well with my family. Nathan offered to come with me. I said no, not because I wanted to protect my parents from embarrassment, and not because I thought I needed to handle everything alone. The meeting was about shares registered in my name and records I had requested as a shareholder. Bringing Nathan into the room would have made it easier for Dad to call the discussion marital interference instead of answering the questions. Nathan understood. Before I left, he only said, "Don't let them change the subject." I told him I wouldn't. Then I walked into the exact kind of room where my father had spent decades learning how to change subjects without making it look like he had. Dad was already seated when I arrived. Mom sat beside him with a legal pad and a thick accordion folder. That surprised me. She had always treated company finance as something both important and too boring for everyone else to discuss. But seeing the folder told me she had not come as my mother. She had come as the person who knew where the supporting records lived. Dad gestured toward the chair across from them. "Sit down. I'm fine here," he frowned. "Lauren," I sat because arguing over a chair would have been stupid. Mom opened the folder. "Your father said you had questions. I sent them in writing. We thought it would be faster to explain things in person. That depends on the explanation." Dad gave me the look he used when he thought I was being unnecessarily formal. "This is exactly what I mean. You're treating us like strangers. I asked about business records. And you're talking to your parents. I can do both." Mom sighed before Dad could answer. "Fine. Start with the townhouse." I did. I asked why a private residence occupied by Brittany had been booked under a project label suggesting a promotional showcase. Mom was ready. She pulled out a project authorization form, an invoice package, and a one-page memo describing the residence as a temporary design showcase for selected referral partners. I read everything twice. The project had an approval signature. Dad's. There was a short explanation that the company had installed premium cabinetry and fixtures in Brittany's townhouse at cost in exchange for use of the space as a private demonstration property for design partners and prospective clients. "Where's the event schedule?" I asked. "There wasn't a public event," Mom said. "I didn't ask if it was public." Dad leaned back. "These were private appointments." "How many?" He shrugged. "A handful." "Names?" "Lauren, this isn't a courtroom." "No, it's a business expense. I'm asking what business activity it produced." Mom slid another page toward me. It contained several dates and generic descriptions. Designer consultation, referral partner walkthrough, client preview, no names. I looked up. "Who attended?" "Some of our partners don't want their names distributed unnecessarily," Dad said. "Then redact personal details and show the underlying records." His jaw tightened. "You're proving my point." "What point?" "That you don't understand how relationship-driven businesses work." It was a familiar argument. If something could not survive documentation, Dad called it relationship-driven. If I wanted controls around it, I was trying to run a family company like a government agency. I put the townhouse paperwork aside. The SUV. Mom had that one ready too. It was part of Brittany's executive compensation package. The vehicle was available for store visits, vendor meetings, design events, and client travel. Personal mileage was supposed to be tracked and treated accordingly. Was it? I asked. "Yes," Mom said. "Can I see the mileage treatment?" "That isn't part of the records you requested." She was right. I hated that she was right, but she was. I did not have an unlimited right to demand every supporting detail just because I disliked the answer. I wrote a note to myself and moved on. The Arizona trip had a supplier itinerary. 2 meetings were listed. 1 vendor dinner, 1 site visit. The resort Brittany had posted from was where the supplier group had booked accommodations. "So the trip wasn't personal?" I asked. "It was business," Dad said. She called it a reset. Mom looked irritated. "People can relax after meetings." I nodded. "That's true." The admission seemed to surprise them. Dad leaned forward slightly, as if he had expected me to fight harder. I turned to Northline. This time, Mom did not immediately reach into the folder. That pause was small. I noticed it. Northline Creative, I said. What do they actually do for the company? Dad answered. Brand strategy. That's what the invoices say, because that's what they do. What are the deliverables? Campaign development, regional positioning, content planning. Where are the campaigns? Mom opened the folder and handed me a packet. There they were. Not impressive, but real. A branding framework, a customer segmentation summary, draft messaging for 2 regional campaigns, a proposal for a designer referral program. Several pages were generic enough that they could have been produced for almost any home interiors company. But generic did not mean fake. I felt my confidence move half an inch in the wrong direction. Dad saw it. That's the problem with looking at a line item and deciding you know the story. I didn't decide. You called Diane. I looked at him. He continued. You've been asking employees questions. I asked Diane about process. I specifically told her not to share anything she wasn't allowed to share. Do you understand what that does to people? What? It makes them nervous. They think ownership is fighting. They wonder whether their jobs are safe. I knew what he was doing. He was turning my questions into the threat. That did not mean the concern was entirely false. A company with more than 100 employees could not absorb endless family warfare without consequences. Rumors traveled faster than policy changes. If warehouse staff believed owners were preparing for a battle, they could leave before anything even happened. I said, if asking for records makes the company unstable, the problem isn't the request. No, Dad said. The problem is an inexperienced shareholder who thinks curiosity has no cost. Inexperienced shareholder is fair. Inexperienced with risk is not. You know logistics risk. I know controls. You know controls in a company where nobody shares Thanksgiving dinner with the person who signs the purchase order. I almost smiled. That may be the best argument you've made all morning. Mom did not find it funny. Why are you doing this? The question was different from Dad's. Dad wanted to know what I was trying to find. Mom wanted to know what was wrong with me for looking. I own part of the company, I said. I received documents that raised questions. I asked the questions. You didn't care about this company 3 weeks ago. That doesn't make the records different. You left us, Lauren. I stared at her. It was such a revealing choice of words that for a moment I forgot the spreadsheet in front of me. I left a job. You left the family business. I didn't leave the family. Mom looked down. Dad stepped in. Nobody is saying you did. She just did. Your mother is emotional. Mom turned toward him. Don't do that. For the first time that morning, neither of them looked prepared. Then Dad straightened his papers and brought us back to territory he controlled. You want to know why I'm concerned about Henry giving you shares? Yes. Because he knew exactly what he was doing. What was he doing? Creating leverage. For what? Against me. That sounds like something you should discuss with Henry. I have. And? He wants more formal controls, more outside oversight, less flexibility. Those don't sound radical. Because you haven't run this company. There it was again. He pushed the folder toward me. You walked away almost 10 years ago. Brittany stayed. Your mother stayed. I stayed. We went through supply shortages, a showroom expansion that nearly failed, staffing problems, interest rate pressure, vendor consolidation. You weren't here. I was working somewhere else. I know. I wasn't hiding. I didn't say you were. Then stop talking like leaving was a betrayal. Dad was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice changed. I was proud of you. The sentence landed harder than anything else he had said. I did not move. He continued. You think I didn't notice what you built? I did. I heard about every promotion. I knew when you moved into senior risk. I knew when your company gave you the regional portfolio. I had never told him about the regional portfolio. Mom must have. Dad looked directly at me. I knew you would be fine. There were 100 answers I could have given him. None came out. He said, that's exactly why I never worried about you. I wish I could say I heard the cruelty immediately. I did not. For one stupid second, all I heard was the part I had wanted since I was 29. I was proud of you. Dad had never been generous with praise once I left Whitmore Home Group. He congratulated me when I changed jobs. He asked about salary without asking whether I liked the work. He introduced me to friends as the daughter who went corporate, usually with a tone that made it sound like an exotic medical condition. I had told myself none of that mattered. Apparently it had. Mom softened when she saw my face. "You've always been the one we didn't have to worry about." There it was. The same sentence wearing nicer clothes. Dad had been proud enough not to worry. Mom had trusted me enough not to protect. Brittany had needed enough to receive. I had succeeded my way into becoming the person everyone believed could afford to lose more. I looked down at the folder before they could see how deeply that landed. Mom reached across the table. Brittany was having a terrible year. I moved my hand before she touched it. That does not explain my wedding gifts. She needed things. They weren't yours. Lorraine? No. We keep turning this into whether Brittany needed help. She can need help, and the gifts can still belong to Nathan and me. You two already had a home. So, you weren't going to use half of those things. Did you ask? Mom's mouth tightened. You always land on your feet, she said. I looked at her. This time, the sentence did not sound like praise. It sounded like policy. Dad pushed his chair back slightly. This is going nowhere. No, it's becoming very clear. Don't confuse resentment with clarity. I almost answered too quickly. Instead, I looked at the paperwork again. That saved me. Because underneath the anger was an uncomfortable truth. They had answered more of my questions than I expected. Not perfectly. Not completely. But enough that my first theory looked less solid than it had 2 days earlier. The townhouse had paperwork. The SUV had an executive compensation explanation. The Arizona trip had a business itinerary. Northline had deliverables. Could all of that still hide improper transactions? Yes. Could some of it also be legitimate? Yes. I had walked into the room expecting contradictions to collapse under direct questioning. Instead, I had discovered my father had spent 30 years running a company and knew how to make gray areas look ordinary. I had moved too fast. The realization irritated me, but I did not let pride push me farther than the evidence. I want copies of everything you showed me today that falls within the records I'm entitled to receive, I said. Dad folded his arms. Of course you do. Yes. Mom looked exhausted. Is there any point where you decide this has gone far enough? Yes. When? When I understand what I own. Dad glanced at the clock. Then we should discuss the other option. He pulled one final packet from his briefcase. I recognized the cover. Proposed redemption. I had already read the digital version. This isn't binding, I said. No. And it requires board approval. Yes. Then why are we discussing it before the board has approved anything? Because there's no reason to waste everyone's time if you're not interested. I'm listening. Dad opened the valuation. His tone became almost paternal again. Whitmore is still a good company, but we have debt. We've committed to expansion. Margins are under pressure. If this turns into a prolonged shareholder dispute, the cost won't just be money. Management gets distracted. Vendors get nervous. Employees hear rumors. Distributions may be reduced. Your shares could lose value. I understand that. You also have your own career, your own marriage, your own plans. Do you really want to spend the next 2 years reading board packets and paying lawyers because Henry decided to make a point? There was something clever about the way he framed it. He did not threaten me with personal liability. He knew better. He threatened me with inconvenience. Time, legal fees, distraction, volatility. All things I valued accurately enough to respect. What are you offering? I asked. Dad tapped the valuation. I read the number again. It was low, but not cartoonishly low. Low enough that if the company's internal forecast was as pessimistic as the packet suggested, someone could defend it. I turned to the forecast. Revenue slowdown, margin compression, higher debt service, expansion costs, lower expected distributions. If those assumptions were accurate, the proposed price had logic behind it. What happens if I agree? I asked. You sign an indication that you're willing to proceed at the proposed valuation. subject to final documentation and board approval. Council handles the redemption paperwork. Who funds it? The company, assuming the board approves. And if the board doesn't? Then there's no deal. That's more accurate than the cover letter makes it sound. Dad's expression hardened. The cover letter says, proposed. It also says the company is willing to redeem, as if the decision has already been made. Now you're editing grammar. I'm reading what you gave me. Mom rubbed her forehead. This is what he means. Everything becomes a technical argument. No. The technical part matters when the technical part controls whether the offer exists. Dad put his hand over the packet. Forget the wording. Do you want out or not? I looked at him. Why are you in such a hurry? I'm not. You sent this before answering my second records request. I sent it because I don't want this family tearing itself apart over 12% of a company you never asked to own. That sentence sounded reasonable. Too reasonable. I said, I'm not signing today. Dad nodded once. I expected that. I'm going to review the valuation. Of course. And the assumptions. Do whatever you need to do. He sounded calm again, which somehow bothered me more than his anger. I gathered my papers. As I stood, Mom said, Lauren, please think about what your life looked like before Henry did this. I turned back. It looked like my parents gave my wedding gifts to my sister. Her face changed. I left before she could tell me that was not what she meant. The drive home took 35 minutes. I remember because I spent almost the entire time arguing with myself. I had expected to leave the meeting more certain. Instead, I was less certain. That was not failure in the professional sense. Good analysis often narrowed certainty before improving it. Emotionally, it felt like losing. I had wanted Dad to be unable to answer. I had wanted Mom's records to be sloppy. I had wanted Northline to look obviously fake. I had wanted evidence that fit neatly into the conclusion I had already started building. Instead, I had enough answers to make accusations premature and enough unanswered questions to keep me from walking away. When I got home, Nathan was in the kitchen making dinner. How bad? He asked. Depends which part. Did they answer anything? Too much. He turned from the stove. That doesn't sound bad. It is when you're hoping someone will make your job easy. He studied me. You wanted them to be obviously guilty. I wanted the records to make sense. That is not what you just said. I put my bag on the table harder than necessary. Nathan lowered the heat under the pan and waited. I hated when he waited. What? I said. You tell me. They had explanations. The townhouse was allegedly a private demonstration property. The SUV is part of Brittany's comp. Arizona had supplier meetings. Northline has deliverables. Do you believe them? I believe the documents exist. That's not the same question. I know. I pulled the proposed redemption packet from my bag. And Dad wants to buy me out. Nathan read the front page. You're not doing this tonight. I laughed without humor. I absolutely am. Loren. What? You've been in this house 12 minutes. And you've already opened your laptop. I looked down. He was right. My laptop was open. I did not remember opening it. Nathan leaned against the counter. Can I ask you something without you turning it into a project? That depends on the question. When was the last time you were angry instead of productive? I stared at him. I am angry. No, you're organized. That's how I handle anger. I know. Then why are we discussing it? Because sometimes I think you treat feelings like errors in a report. Find the source. Correct the process. Close the issue. I felt irritation rise immediately. I'm trying to protect myself. I didn't say you weren't. My parents took our wedding gifts. My uncle transferred me into a company fight without telling me. My father is trying to buy me out before I've even seen everything I requested. What exactly would you like me to do, Nathan? Sit on the couch and experience it? He did not flinch. No. Good. I'd like you to notice that your hurt before you decide hurting them back is the same thing as solving it. That stopped me. Not because I agreed, because I had not said anything about hurting them back, at least not aloud. I closed the laptop. Dinner first, I said. Nathan nodded. Dinner first. We ate without talking about the company for almost 20 minutes. It was surprisingly difficult. Afterward, I went back to work. But I did it differently. Instead of trying to prove my parents wrong, I started with the possibility that they were right. What if the townhouse project had a legitimate business purpose? What if the SUV was properly accounted for? What if the Arizona trip was primarily business? What if Northline had produced everything it had been paid to produce? If all of that were true, what still bothered me? The proposed redemption. Not because Dad wanted to buy me out. Private companies bought back shares for all kinds of reasons. What bothered me was timing. I had become a shareholder less than 2 weeks earlier. I had asked a second round of questions. Before those questions were fully answered, Dad had presented a valuation describing the company as a relatively risky asset I should consider exiting quickly. I read the forecast again. Then I went back through the quarterly management report I had received with my first document package. The language there was cautious, but not nearly as dark. Whitmore Home Group had been discussing selective expansion. There were references to a strong pipeline in 2 markets. Vendor pricing pressure was expected to ease. Management believed new referral programs could support revenue growth. Those statements were not necessarily inconsistent with the redemption forecast. A forecast could change. Different scenarios could use different assumptions. One could be an upside case and another a downside case. I knew that, so I did not write fraud in my notes. I wrote, "Why did assumptions change?" Then another memory surfaced. Months before the wedding, Dad had mentioned refinancing during a family dinner. He had complained that banks wanted a novel every time a company renewed a credit facility. Brittany had joked that the lender deck made Whitmore look like it was about to conquer Ohio. At the time, I had barely listened. Now I remembered the phrase, lender deck. I did not have it. But if Dad had recently presented the company to a lender as stronger than the version he was presenting to me, the difference did not automatically prove wrongdoing. It would, however, tell me whether this gloomy valuation reflected his actual expectations or simply the assumptions most useful for getting me to sell. I added one line to my notes. Get lender assumptions, if legitimately available, through review. Then I stopped. That was the other lesson from the meeting. I did not need to solve everything in one night. The next morning, I reopened my Northline folder, not because I thought Northline was necessarily the answer, but because it was the one piece of Dad's explanation that had felt prepared rather than natural. The deliverables existed. Fine, the vendor still had to have come from somewhere. I pulled the public business registration again and stopped looking at the current address. I looked at dates. Northline Creative had been formed a little over 2 years earlier. I compared the date to Brittany's employment history. I still had an old announcement from Whitmore's website congratulating her on a promotion to Vice President of Brand Development. I put the dates side by side. Northline had been formed 9 days before Brittany's promotion. That could still be coincidence. Then I looked at the original registered mailing address, the same condo complex I had already connected to Evan Mercer. This time, I went one step farther and checked the old public filing naming Northline's first principal, Mercer, not Evan, his brother. I sat back. Dad had been right about one thing. I had moved too fast when I walked into that conference room thinking one bad-looking expense would break the story open. It was not one expense. It was timing, relationships, approvals, patterns. And for the first time, I was no longer asking whether Northline had done real work. I was asking why a company tied to Brittany's boyfriend's family had been created 9 days before Brittany received the exact promotion that gave her influence over brand spending. 9 days before Brittany's promotion. That was the first detail that made me stop treating Northline Creative like a strange vendor and start treating it like a relationship I needed to understand. The company had been formed, registered, and given a mailing address tied to Evan Mercer's brother less than 2 weeks before Brittany became Vice President of Brand Development. A few months later, Northline began receiving work from Whitmore Home Group. The invoices were not enormous. That was part of what made them effective. $20,000 here, $12,000 there, another consulting fee 3 months later. Individually, they looked like the kind of expenses nobody wanted to spend an afternoon arguing about. Together, they formed a pattern that had lasted more than 2 years. I built a timeline from public records and the documents I already had. Northline was formed first. Brittany was promoted 9 days later. The company's first Whitmore invoice appeared shortly after that. Payments increased as Brittany took more control over branding decisions. Then came the townhouse project, the SUV assignment, the supplier travel, and several other executive benefits I had already flagged. I was careful not to write conclusions into the spreadsheet. I wrote dates, amounts, approval paths, and relationships. Under a column labeled Verified Relationship, I entered only what I could prove. Evan Mercer was Brittany's boyfriend. Evan's brother was connected to Northline's original registration. Brittany worked in the department that purchased Northline's services. Susan had approved or recategorized several expenses that benefited Brittany personally. Dad appeared on some executive approvals. None of that automatically meant money had been stolen. It did mean the conflicts were more connected than they had looked when I first saw them one row at a time. By then, I understood why Dad's first defense had been so effective. Every transaction had an explanation. The townhouse was supposedly a showcase. The SUV was compensation. Arizona was supplier development. Northline had deliverables. If I challenged each expense separately, I could spend months arguing over whether one dinner, one lease, or one cabinet installation had enough business purpose. The stronger question was not whether each item could be defended. It was why the same small group of people kept benefiting from exceptions, approving each other's decisions, and describing personal advantages in language that made them look more business-related than they really were. I asked corporate counsel for the material-related party disclosure schedule I was entitled to review. Northline was not listed. That did not prove Brittany had violated anything. Maybe the company did not consider the relationship material. Maybe she had disclosed it somewhere else. Maybe Northline had been selected by someone with no connection to her. But for the first time, I had something I could frame cleanly. If a senior executive influenced vendor spending involving her boyfriend's family, I wanted to know where that relationship had been disclosed and who had approved it. Before I sent another request, I checked everything again. I had learned that the fastest way to lose a good case was to become emotionally attached to the version that made the other side look worst. So I tried to disprove myself. I searched for evidence that Northline had worked with Whitmore before Brittany's promotion. I found none. I looked for evidence that the vendor had been selected through a formal competitive process. Nothing in the materials I had showed that. I searched for proof Brittany did not influence its selection. I did not have that either. The result was not guilty. The result was unanswered. That distinction mattered to me. It mattered even more because something else was happening at the same time. The wedding gifts were still gone. My mother had stopped pretending they were being held temporarily. Brittany had moved most of the boxes into her townhouse, and whenever I asked for a return date, Mom changed the subject to how stressed Dad was about the company. Nathan had become calmer about it than I was, which probably meant he was more angry. He had stopped asking whether they intended to return the gifts, and started asking whether I wanted counsel to include them in a formal demand. I kept saying, "Not yet." Part of me wanted to keep the wedding gifts separate from the corporate issue because I did not want anyone claiming I had launched a shareholder dispute over cookware. Another part of me had begun to realize that separating them too cleanly might be a mistake. The same logic ran through both. Brittany needed something. Therefore, someone else's boundary became flexible. That someone was usually me. The connection became impossible to ignore when my cousin Marissa called me one evening. "I have something weird to ask you," she said. "That is becoming a popular opening. Did you tell Aunt Susan that Brittany could have duplicates from your wedding registry?" I sat up straighter. "No." "Did you tell anyone that?" "No." There was a pause. Marissa sounded uncomfortable. "She told me you did." "When?" "Before the wedding." That removed all humor from the conversation. I asked her to start over and tell me exactly what happened. A few weeks before the wedding, Marissa had texted Mom because she wanted to buy Nathan and me a set of serving bowls from our registry. Mom told her that if an item appeared duplicated or if she saw something Brittany could use, she should not worry because I had agreed that extras could go to my sister. Marissa had thought it was strange, but harmless. She assumed I was being generous. I almost bought a second set of towels, she said. Your mom told me not to worry because Brittany needed some. Do you still have the messages? Yes. Can you send screenshots? Lauren, is something wrong? Yes. I did not dramatize it. I told her simply that Nathan and I had never agreed to give our wedding gifts to Brittany and that my parents had moved the gifts to her townhouse after the wedding. Marissa went quiet. Then she said, That's why I'm calling. What do you mean? There's a spreadsheet. I felt my stomach tighten. What spreadsheet? She sent it around to a few people. Who? Mostly family. I thought you knew. I asked her to send whatever she had. 2 minutes later, a screenshot appeared on my phone. It was a shared spreadsheet based on our wedding registry. The columns were labeled Keep, Return, Credit, and Want. My name was nowhere in the title. Brittany's was. For several seconds, I did nothing. Then I zoomed in. The stand mixer was marked Want. The copper cookware was marked Want. The towels were marked Want. Several duplicate serving pieces were marked Return for Credit. Gift cards were listed separately with rough estimates. There were notes besides certain registry items about whether Brittany already had something similar. This had not been improvised in my parents' driveway. It had been planned. The spreadsheet had been created before the wedding. I checked the screenshot date twice. Then I called Marissa back. Did Brittany make this? Yes. How do you know? Because she sent me the link. Directly? Yes. What did she say? Marissa hesitated. Send that too. The message arrived while we were still on the phone. Brittany had written that Mom wanted to make sure nothing useful went to waste, and that everyone should let her know if they bought something that might work better for Brittany's new place. There was no mention of my permission. No mention of Nathan. No mention of duplicates only. Just an assumption that parts of our registry were already available for redistribution. I thanked Marissa and told her not to argue with anyone on my behalf. I did not want a family campaign. I wanted records. Over the next 24 hours, 2 more relatives sent me messages after Marissa quietly asked whether they had received anything similar. One aunt had been told I already had everything. Another cousin had been told I was fine with Brittany taking household items because Nathan and I were established. Mom had not simply decided after the wedding that Brittany needed help. She had been preparing people before the wedding to accept the idea that my property could become Brittany's property if someone in the family judged Brittany's need greater than mine. That hurt more than I expected. Not because I was shocked. Because it was organized. I could tolerate favoritism more easily when I told myself it was emotional and messy. Mom saw Brittany upset, panicked, and made a bad decision. Dad indulged her. Everyone moved on. A spreadsheet was different. A spreadsheet meant someone had sat down in advance and categorized what part of my wedding might be useful to my sister. I saved every screenshot. Then I saw one line that made me close my eyes. Wooden recipe box. The note beside it read, Donate. I knew exactly which one it was. My friend Claire had made it by hand. She had known Nathan and me for years and asked friends and family to write recipes, notes, and small memories on cards that she placed inside. It probably cost less than several of the towels Brittany had marked Want. Financially, it was almost irrelevant. Emotionally, it was the first gift on the list that made me furious. I called Brittany. She answered on the 4th ring. What? I'm looking at your registry spreadsheet. Silence. Not surprise. Silence. I said. You made this before my wedding. Mom and I were just trying to figure out duplicates. There are items marked Want. Because you had things you weren't going to use. You didn't know that. You already have a kitchen. So do you. That's not the point. Then explain the point. She exhaled hard. Lauren. You always turn everything into ownership and permission. It was just stuff. The recipe box. What about it? You marked it Donate. I didn't know what it was. You could have asked. I thought it was another decorative box. It had my name on it. So? That single word told me more about Brittany than the entire spreadsheet. So? If something belonged to me but had no obvious use to her, it could be thrown away. If it had value to her, she could take it. In neither case did my preference matter. I said, Did Mom tell you I agreed to any of this? She said you wouldn't care. That wasn't my question. You're doing that lawyer thing again. I'm not a lawyer. You know what I mean. No, I know what Dad means when he says it. That stopped her. I continued. Did I agree? No. Did Nathan? No. Then you knew. I knew you didn't need it. That is not the same thing. You have more than I do. I almost laughed because there it was in its purest form. Not need. Entitlement. You think that makes my things yours? I think family is supposed to help each other. Then why didn't you ask? She had no answer. I ended the call before anger pushed me into saying something I would regret. For the next hour, I sat at the kitchen table staring at two entirely different piles of evidence. On one side, corporate records. On the other, wedding messages. They were legally separate problems. Emotionally, they were the same story. I opened a blank email. At first, I addressed it to corporate counsel. Then I added Henry. Then one independent director whose contact information appeared in the shareholder materials. Then I added another. Then I added Dad, Mom, Brittany, Diane, 2 family members. Then I added several people in management whose names appeared on approvals. My anger was doing what my professional instincts normally prevented. Expanding scope. The message grew with it. Northline, the townhouse, the registry spreadsheet, the wedding gifts, Mom's massage, Dad's buyout offer, every document I had, every suspicion I had, every question I wanted someone else to force them to answer. By the time I finished, the email was more than 2,000 words long and addressed to people who had no legitimate reason to see half of it. My finger hovered over send. For one moment, I wanted the explosion. I wanted Dad to walk into work and discover that every person whose respect mattered to him had received a map of every contradiction I had found. I wanted Mom's family network to see the spreadsheet before she could tell them I had misunderstood. I wanted Brittany to feel the same loss of control she had treated as normal when it happened to me. Then I looked at the recipient list. Warehouse employees were not responsible for what my father had done. Managers who had never approved a questionable expense did not deserve to become collateral damage. Relatives did not need confidential corporate information. Vendors did not need to know about my wedding. If I sent that email, I would be doing something I had accused my family of doing for years. Using other people as tools because I was angry, I deleted the employee addresses. Then the relatives. Then Dad, Mom, and Brittany. I removed the independent directors too. In the end, only corporate counsel remained. I rewrote the message from the beginning. No accusation, no speech. I attached the Northline timeline, the related party question, the wedding registry screenshot only as context for why I believed there might be a broader pattern of coordination between Susan and Brittany, and the documents I already had showing unusual classifications. I asked a narrow question. Given the emerging records dispute and the possibility that supporting documentation might become material to a formal shareholder inquiry, what was the appropriate process for preserving relevant records while I continued to determine whether an independent review was warranted? The answer came the next morning. Counsel suggested a formal preservation notice focused on records potentially relevant to the books and records dispute and related party questions. That was exactly what I wanted. Not a public accusation. Not a threat, a line in the sand. The notice went out through counsel later that day. It identified categories of records that should be preserved, including vendor files, invoices, approval materials, relevant emails, version histories, audit logs, and electronic documents tied to the transactions already under question. It did not claim anyone had committed fraud. It did not order people not to work on files. It simply made clear that existing versions and relevant records should not be deleted or destroyed while the dispute was being reviewed. Dad called me an hour after it went out. I let it go to voicemail. He did not leave one. Mom texted, "This is getting out of control." I replied, "Then preserving the records should help." She did not answer. 2 days later, the company produced another batch of supporting documents in response to my earlier request. At first, I thought Dad had been right. The files looked much better. Too much better. Northline invoices now had detailed explanatory memos attached. Several executive expenses had business purpose notes. The townhouse project had an additional memo explaining why private residential use supported the company's brand strategy. If I had received those documents at the beginning, several of my questions would have looked weaker. That was the problem. I opened one of the memos. The date printed at the top was 6 months earlier. I checked the document properties. The file appeared to have been created the previous night. I did not call Dad. I did not call Mom. I did not write backdated in my notes. A creation date could change when files were copied, exported, migrated, or recreated. I knew better than to treat one timestamp like a confession. I sent the file to counsel and wrote one sentence. Please preserve the original and have the version history and audit trail reviewed. Then I opened a second memo. Same pattern. A third. Again. By the time I closed my laptop, I was no longer looking at a questionable vendor or a family that had crossed a line with wedding gifts. I was looking at records that had suddenly become cleaner only after I started asking questions. And for the first time, I wondered whether the thing that would finally bring my parents down was not what they had done before I became a shareholder. It was what they were doing now. The next morning, corporate counsel told me not to assume anything from the file properties alone. A document could show a recent creation date because it had been copied, exported from another system, converted to a new format, or reconstructed from an older source. That was exactly why I had not called my parents the night before. Suspicion was easy. Proof required patience. Counsel arranged for an outside forensic consultant to review the relevant files, not because anyone had established wrongdoing, but because the timing of the new supporting memos made document history material to the dispute. I handed over the versions I had received and stopped touching them. For 3 days, nothing happened publicly. Privately, my parents behaved as if I had declared war. Mom called twice and left increasingly emotional messages. The first said I was humiliating the family by involving outside professionals. The second said Dad had barely slept since the preservation notice and asked whether I understood what stress could do to a man his age. Dad sent no messages at all. Brittany texted once to ask whether I was seriously trying to destroy the company over towels. I did not answer any of them. Nathan asked me whether the silence bothered me. It's better than being lied to. That wasn't the question. I was beginning to hate how often he said that. Yes, I admitted. It bothers me. Why? Because Dad gets quieter when he thinks he's losing control. Nathan nodded. That sounds like information. It's experience. There was a difference, and I was trying very hard not to blur it. The forensic review came back in stages. The first finding was cautious. Several files did appear to have been created recently, but that alone meant little. The second finding was more useful. The consultant compared those files against version histories and audit logs from the company's document system. Some of the supporting memos had no earlier versions. They had been created after my records request, after questions about the transactions had already been raised, and then given internal dates that made them appear as though they had existed at the time of the original expenses. That still did not tell us why. A company could create after-the-fact documentation for legitimate reasons. People sometimes reconstructed missing records during audits or litigation. The key question was whether the documents were clearly identified as later reconstructions or whether they were being presented as contemporaneous support. These were not marked as reconstructions. They looked like old records. Counsel asked the consultant to continue. Then we found the messages. I did not receive someone's entire private phone history. The relevant communications surfaced because the independent document preservation process included company accounts and company-managed devices tied to the transactions under review. Counsel provided only the material that fell within the scope of the dispute. One message was from Mom to Brittany. Delete the old version from your side. Another, sent later the same evening, said, Dad said we only need the clean invoices if Lauren asks. I read that sentence 4 times. Nathan was sitting across from me. What does clean mean? He asked. I don't know. You have a theory. Yes. Is it evidence? No. I hated how much I had trained him. On its own, the message could be explained. Clean invoices, could mean corrected invoices, complete invoices, final invoices. A missing attachment, fixed and reissued. Delete the old version could be ordinary version control. But the messages did not exist on their own. They existed beside newly created supporting memos carrying old dates. They existed beside version histories showing no prior copies. They existed after my request had specifically raised questions about related party transactions. They existed after counsel had told everyone to preserve relevant records. Pattern changed meaning. I sent everything back to counsel with one instruction. I wanted the strongest innocent interpretation considered before anyone used the material against my family. The attorney called me. You know that's not your job. What isn't? Finding the innocent explanation. It is if I'm the person pushing this forward. No. Your job is to be accurate. Ours is to test the evidence. I don't want this turning into a family vendetta dressed up as governance. There was a pause. That, he said, is a good reason not to run the review yourself. He was right. I hated that too. I agreed that the material should go through the proper process rather than through me. I was still a shareholder. I was still a daughter. I was also becoming angry enough that I no longer trusted myself to occupy every role at once. Dad finally called that afternoon. I answered. Are you proud of yourself? He asked. There was no greeting. For what? You've got outside consultants crawling through company files. Employees are whispering. Vendors are asking questions. I haven't contacted any vendors. You don't have to. People see things. Then tell them there's a document review. That calms everyone down. It's true. Truth is not the same thing as judgment. The line was so close to something I might have said that it caught me off guard. Dad continued. Do you have any idea what happens when people think ownership is fighting? Good employees start looking. Banks get nervous. Vendors tighten terms. All because you found a few documents you don't like. A few documents weren't my concern. What is? The way they changed after I asked about them. They were completed. Then why were they dated as though they existed months earlier? You don't understand our filing system. The forensic reviewer does. Silence. I had hit something. He changed direction. Diane's been talking to you. Diane told me about process. She didn't give me files. That doesn't matter. You're pulling employees into this. No, you are. How? By making them work in a company where a family account apparently explains things that would need approval anywhere else. His voice hardened. You think you can come back after 10 years and save everyone? I'm not trying to save everyone. That's what this always is with you. You need to be the person who sees the problem before anyone else. The smartest person in the room. That landed because there was truth in it. Not enough truth to excuse what he was doing. Enough to make me uncomfortable. I said, maybe I do like being right. You do. But I was wrong about some things already. He went quiet. The Arizona trip had business meetings. The SUV may be legitimate compensation. Northline produced real work. I know that. Then stop. No, why not? Because real work doesn't erase an undisclosed relationship. And legitimate benefits don't explain why supporting records suddenly appeared after questions were raised. He exhaled sharply. You have no idea what you're setting in motion. Then explain it. I've tried. No, you've told me I don't understand. Because you don't. I understand enough to know the company should survive someone asking who approved an invoice. Dad ended the call. I sat there for several minutes, angrier at myself than I expected. The smartest person in the room, comment stayed with me. Because that was one of my flaws. I did not need praise, but I hated uncertainty. I hated leaving a question unresolved. I hated the idea that someone might possess an explanation I had not found. My father had spent years interpreting those traits as disloyalty. I had spent years interpreting them as professionalism. The truth was probably less flattering to both of us. Sometimes I asked questions because they mattered. Sometimes I asked because not knowing made me feel powerless. That evening, Nathan asked what Dad had said. He thinks I'm destabilizing the company. Are you? Maybe a little. Nathan waited. I corrected myself. The review is creating uncertainty. That doesn't mean the review is wrong. Better. I wasn't asking to be graded. I know. I told him about the employee concern. He said, "Can you keep digging without setting the whole place on fire?" That was the question I needed. Not whether I could win, whether I could be precise. The next day, I called Diane again. This time, I did not ask about records. I asked about people. "How bad are the rumors?" She sighed. "Bad enough." "Are people leaving?" "Not yet." "Are they scared?" "Some." "About what?" "Depends who you ask." "Warehouse thinks expansion could get cut." "Showroom staff think there's a family fight over ownership." "Finance is mostly pretending nobody knows anything." "I don't want this hurting people who didn't do anything." "I know." "Do they know that?" Diane was quiet. Then she said, "Lauren, people don't judge ownership by what it intends. They judge it by what happens to payroll." That sentence stayed with me too. I asked whether there were operational signs of a real crisis. "No." "Missed payroll?" "No." "Vendor holds?" "No." "Credit issues?" "Not that I know." "Then I need you to do one thing." "What?" "Nothing." She laughed softly. "I'm serious. Don't defend me. Don't speculate. Don't send me anything. If someone asks what I'm doing, tell them I'm using the formal process. That will disappoint a lot of people." "Good." Before we hung up, Diane said, "For what it's worth, I'm glad somebody asked. I don't know yet whether you should be. That sounds less like the Lauren I remember." "What was wrong with that one?" She always knew. I smiled despite myself. "I'm working on it." The review made Henry impossible to avoid. He called after counsel informed him, in his capacity as a director, that the new evidence might warrant independent board involvement. "We need to talk," he said. "You're right." We met at a coffee shop halfway between my office and his house. I deliberately chose somewhere outside Whitmore Home Group because I did not want every employee who saw us together inventing a new theory. Henry looked older than he had at my wedding. Not physically older, more tired. I put my coffee down. "How much did you know? Before I transferred the shares?" "Yes. I knew controls had gotten looser." "That's vague." "It's also true." "What exactly did you know?" He rubbed a hand across his jaw. "I knew David was approving too many exceptions himself. I knew Susan had too much authority over classifications, without enough independent review. I knew Brittany was getting benefits I thought should have been disclosed more clearly. Northline? I knew they were a vendor. I didn't know the Mercer relationship until recently. The townhouse? I knew the company had paid for some installation work. David told me it was a showcase project. Did you believe him? At first? And later? I stopped being sure. I leaned back. "So you gave me shares?" "Yes." "Because you wanted transparency?" "Yes." "And because you didn't want to fight him yourself?" Henry looked at me. "That's not fair." "It's exactly fair. I've fought David for years. Privately. That's usually how partners handle disagreements. Until private disagreement stops working." His expression tightened. I continued before he could turn this into an argument about tone. "You saw controls getting weaker. You knew Dad ignored you. Instead of using your own position harder, you transferred leverage to me. I gave you ownership because I trust you. Those can both be true." He looked away. That was the moment I knew I had him. Not because I had won, because he stopped defending himself. "I thought giving you the shares would force David to behave," he said. I felt anger rise again. "You thought giving me the shares would force me to confront him." Henry did not answer. "You handed me a problem at my wedding. I thought I was giving you protection." "Against what?" "Being shut out." "Henry, I was shut out because I left." "You were pushed out before you left." That silenced me. He continued. "You think I didn't see it? David trusted your work. He just hated when your judgment competed with his. Brittany never threatened him that way. That doesn't make what you did better." "No." "At least he did not try." Henry stared down at his coffee. "I should have confronted him harder years ago." "Yes. I told myself I was protecting the company. So did Dad. That hurt him." "Good. He needed it too." Then I said the thing I had finally understood. "You can help now without becoming the hero of this story." "I'm not trying to be." "Then don't defend me. Don't tell the board I'm right because you trust me. Tell them what you actually knew, when you knew it, and what you did about it." Henry nodded slowly. I can do that. That conversation changed something in me. For the first time, I stopped dividing the people around me into the ones helping me and the ones opposing me. Henry was helping. Henry had also failed for years. Diane was supportive. Diane still had a job to protect. Nathan loved me. Nathan did not automatically agree with every decision I made. Those complications did not weaken the truth. They made it more reliable. By the end of the week, counsel and the forensic reviewer had enough to recommend that the matter move beyond my individual shareholder requests. The package was intentionally narrow. It included the related party questions around Northline, the classification issues surrounding certain benefits, the creation of supporting memos after questions were raised, the version history findings, and the messages about deleting old versions and using clean invoices. It did not include every family grievance. It did not include a speech about my childhood. It did not include the recipe box. The wedding evidence stayed separate except where it helped establish that Susan and Brittany had coordinated decisions affecting property and later denied doing so. Even then, counsel cautioned against pretending a wedding dispute proved a corporate offense. I agreed. I asked that the evidence go to the independent directors and that they determine whether a formal outside review was warranted. I did not ask them to fire Dad. I did not ask them to remove Mom. I did not ask them to terminate Brittany. I asked them to review the transactions and document integrity independently. That was enough. Dad could still call me vindictive. Mom could still tell the family I had brought outsiders into private business. Brittany could still tell people I was angry about wedding gifts. But none of those explanations could erase the dates on the records. 2 nights later, I was in bed when my phone rang. It was after 11. Brittany. I almost let it go to voicemail. Then I answered. Her voice was different. Not angry. Afraid. Lauren. What happened? There was noise in the background, like she was pacing. Dad is going to blame me for all of it. I sat up. What are you talking about? I found something. Where? That doesn't matter. It matters if you want me to use it. She breathed hard into the phone. He wrote a statement. For the board. He says I handled Northline independently. He says senior management didn't know what I was doing. I was fully awake now. Send it. He knew. Brittany. He knew everything. Send me the document. A few seconds later, my phone buzzed. A PDF appeared in our text thread. I opened it. The title was Draft Management Statement. Halfway down the first page was the sentence that explained why my sister sounded terrified. Brittany Whitmore had acted beyond the scope of her authority in managing certain vendor relationships, and senior management had not been aware of the full extent of those activities. Dad had spent years protecting Brittany from consequences. Now that the consequences were coming for him, he was preparing to hand them all to her. I read the draft statement twice before I called Brittany back. The first time, I read it as her sister. The second time, I read it the way I would have read any risk document that suddenly appeared in the middle of a dispute. The language was careful. It did not accuse her of theft. It did something more useful. It created distance. Brittany had allegedly managed certain vendor relationships independently. Senior management had supposedly relied on her judgment. Any failure to disclose conflicts or properly document services had happened outside the scope of what leadership understood at the time. Dad was not saying Brittany was innocent. He was preparing to say he had been uninformed. Where did you get this? I asked when she answered. I told you. That doesn't matter. It matters a lot. I found it in a folder Dad left open. On a company system? She hesitated. In his office. Then don't send me anything else until counsel tells us how to handle it. Lauren, are you listening to me? He's blaming me. I'm listening. That doesn't make chain of custody optional. She made a sound of disbelief. This is exactly what you do. What? You turn everything into procedure. Right now, procedure is the only thing keeping this from becoming your word against his. She went quiet. I could hear her breathing through the phone. A week earlier, I probably would have enjoyed that silence. I would have wanted her to sit in the fear she had helped create. But hearing it now did not feel satisfying. It felt familiar. Did he know about Northline? I asked. Yes. What does yes mean? He knew Evan was connected to them. Connected how? He knew Marcus started the company. Marcus Mercer. Evan's brother. Did you disclose that relationship formally? I told Dad. That isn't what I asked. I told Mom too. Brittany. No, okay. I didn't fill out some stupid conflict form. Did one exist? Yes. Why didn't you use it? Because Dad said we didn't need to make everything look worse than it was. There was the kind of sentence people said when they still did not understand that the problem was no longer appearance. What did Northline actually do? I asked. They did real work. I know. That seemed to surprise her. You know? I saw the deliverables. So why are you acting like it was fake? I'm not. I'm asking whether the relationship was disclosed and whether the payments were approved properly. They did campaigns. They did brand strategy. Marcus was good. Then why hide the relationship? I didn't hide it. You just told me you didn't file the disclosure. That's not the same thing. It is when the people approving the relationship are your parents. She started talking faster. You don't understand what it was like. Dad wanted results. Marcus was cheaper than the agency we used before. He could turn work around quickly. Evan introduced us. Dad knew that. Mom knew that. Everybody knew. Everybody is not a governance process. Oh my God. I let the irritation pass. Did you benefit financially from Northline? No. Did Evan? Pause. I don't know. You don't know whether your boyfriend benefited from a company run by his brother? They're brothers, Lauren. Of course he might have helped him. That's not what I asked, she snapped. No, I did not get checks from Northline. That distinction mattered, and I wrote it down. Brittany had enjoyed company benefits. She might have steered work towards someone close to her, but I did not have evidence that she had personally pocketed Northline's payments, and I was not going to invent it because it would make the story cleaner. What about the townhouse? I asked. That was Dad's idea. What part? Calling it a showcase. I stopped writing. Did the company use it for anything? A few people came through. Clients? Some were designers. How many? I don't remember. Was it primarily your home? Obviously. Did Dad know that? Obviously. I had to close my eyes for a second. The word told me how normal this had become to her. Obviously the company paid for improvements in her home. Obviously Dad knew. Obviously Mom approved. Obviously nobody needed formal disclosure because the people with authority were already family. Did you think any of that was wrong? I asked. I thought it was how things worked. That answer was probably the most honest thing she had said. Then she added, You never wanted anything from Dad anyway. And there it was. The family doctrine. I wanted my wedding gifts. You know what I mean. No, say it. You always had your own money, your own job, your own life. Dad helping me wasn't taking something from you. Until you started taking things that were mine. She sighed. We are not doing the registry again. Yes, we are. Why? Because it tells me whether this is the first time you confused permission with access. She went silent again. I continued. You made the spreadsheet. Yes. Mom knew. Yes. Dad? He knew Mom wanted to give me some of the household stuff. Did he know about the ivory box? Another pause. Yes. I felt something inside me settle. Not anger. Confirmation. How? Mom asked him whether she should leave that one alone. He told her to take everything. That was the first evidence I had heard that directly supported Erisa. That was the first evidence I had heard that directly supported the theory I had refused to treat as fact. Brittany was scared, and scared people sometimes remembered events in the version most useful to them. But now I had a specific statement that could be tested against texts, timing, and what Dad already knew about the transfer. Why did he want the box? He said Henry was trying to stir things up. That's not an answer. He thought if you didn't know what was in it right away, he could talk to you before Henry turned it into a fight. I looked at the original photo from the family chat on my laptop. Dad had never believed the certificate changed ownership. He had believed information changed power. That made more sense. Did you know the shares were mine before you opened the box? No. Did you think the box itself became yours because Mom gave it to you? Brittany sounded defensive again. She said the gifts were mine. It had my name on it. So did other things? I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny left in it. Why did you post it? I thought it would annoy you. There was no excuse attached to that answer. Just pettiness. I appreciated the honesty more than I wanted to. Why are you helping me now? I asked. Because Dad is going to throw me under the bus. That's why you're helping yourself. Does it matter? Yes. How? Because if you're expecting me to treat this like redemption, I'm not. Her voice changed. I gave you the statement. You gave me something because you were afraid? So that may be the first useful thing you've done in this mess, but it does not erase the rest of it. You're unbelievable. No, I'm consistent. She laughed bitterly. You always wanted consequences for everyone. No. I wanted the same rules to apply to everyone. That's the same thing to you, only because you grew up without them. The line landed hard. She stopped talking. When she spoke again, her voice was lower. He was going to let me take the fall. I stared at the spreadsheet still open beside the PDF. For the first time, I did not see Brittany as the favored daughter. I saw her as the person Dad had chosen to protect, right up until protecting her threatened him. Then he had started writing a version of events where she could absorb the damage. The irony was almost cruel. Now you know what it feels like, I said. She did not answer. I let the silence sit, then added, That does not make what you did to me disappear. I know. It was the first time she said those words without arguing afterward. The next morning, I sent the draft statement to counsel with an explanation of how Brittany said she obtained it. I did not use it in any accusation until counsel determined how it could appropriately be handled. Brittany was separately interviewed as part of the developing independent review, and she provided her own messages, emails, and explanations, directly instead of using me as a conduit. That distinction protected everyone, including her. Her interview produced more than I expected. She had texts showing Dad knew Northline was connected to Evan's family. There were messages where she asked whether she needed to formalize the conflict, and Dad told her not to create unnecessary paperwork if the vendor was delivering real value. There were messages from Mom about coding certain townhouse expenses under the showcase project. There was also an exchange where Mom reminded Brittany to stop using the company vehicle for personal weekend travel without recording mileage because Lauren is already asking questions. The messages did not make Brittany innocent. They made the family structure visible. Dad authorized the culture. Mom operationalized it. Brittany benefited from it and learned not to question it. And when scrutiny arrived, all three began describing their roles differently. Counsel would not let me treat Brittany's statements as proof by themselves. That was fine with me. The outside reviewers matched her messages against email timestamps, approval logs, vendor records, and the versions of invoices already preserved. Several details lined up. Northline's relationship had been known to Dad before the first major contract. Mom had participated in expense classification. Brittany had personally approved some work and received company benefits that should have been treated more carefully. Dad had visibility into far more than the draft management statement suggested. That last point mattered most. The draft statement said, Senior management had not understood the full scope of Brittany's vendor activities. The preserved emails showed Dad asking for Northline campaign updates. He had approved budget increases. He had been copied on discussions about the townhouse installation. He had responded to a question about the Mercer relationship by saying, If the work is good and the price is right, I don't care who they're dating. I read that email twice. It did not prove theft. It proved knowledge. Dad could still argue the transactions were defensible. He could no longer credibly argue he had known nothing. Mom was more difficult to read, because her role existed in the gray zone between finance and family protection. Some of her recategorizations had plausible business explanations. Others looked weak. The most damaging issue remained the records created after the dispute had started. The outside reviewers were still tracing who had created which memo and at whose direction. While that work continued, another piece finally arrived. The lender materials. I did not receive them, because I demanded confidential banking files personally. The independent review of yours. Relevant financial presentation because Dad's proposed redemption valuation had become part of the governance dispute, and the board needed to understand whether the assumptions used with me were consistent with management's recent representations elsewhere. The lender package had been prepared only a few weeks before Dad offered to buy my shares. I printed both forecasts. Then I placed them side by side. The difference was striking. The redemption packet emphasized margin pressure, debt burden, slowed expansion, reduced distributions, and a conservative revenue outlook. The lender package described resilient margins, a strong project pipeline, easing supplier pressure, expected gains from referral partnerships, and expansion opportunities in 2 markets. Neither document was necessarily false. That was the part I kept reminding myself. Companies model downside cases and upside cases all the time. Banks ask different questions than shareholders. A lending deck and a redemption analysis did not have to use identical assumptions. The problem was that Dad had presented the pessimistic case to me as though it reflected what management actually believed. The lender package had been presented as management's base operating outlook. I asked the reviewer one question. Which set of assumptions did David authorize as the best current view of the company? The answer came later that day. The lender package had been labeled Base Management Forecast. The redemption model had been prepared separately after my ownership became active. That did not automatically make the offer fraudulent. It made the timing impossible to ignore. Dad had known I was a shareholder. He had known I was beginning to ask questions. Then he had produced a more pessimistic valuation model and encouraged me to exit quickly. The pattern was becoming less about one bad expense and more about control. Every time I gained information, Dad tried a different way to limit what I could do with it. First, delay my knowledge of the shares. Then dismiss my understanding. Then offer liquidity. Then defend every transaction individually. Then rewrite the narrative around Brittany. The irony was that each step created more records than the one before it. A few days later, the 2 independent directors and the employee trust director agreed that the preliminary findings justified a formal outside review. Henry participated as a director, but I made sure he did not present himself as my advocate. I did not want a board fight where one brother backed one daughter against another brother. I wanted the documents tested. That was all. At least, that was what I kept telling myself. Nathan saw through me again. "You're waiting for the board to decide whether your father is who you think he is," he said one night. "I already know who he is." "No, you know what he did." I did not answer. He continued. "Those aren't always the same thing." I looked at him. "Do you think that matters? To you?" Yes. I knew he was right. Part of me still wanted Dad to produce one explanation that made everything smaller. Not harmless. Just smaller. A family business with sloppy controls. A father who made bad decisions because he favored one daughter. A mother who cleaned up messes because she was terrified Brittany could not survive them. That would have been painful. It also would have been easier. Instead, every new document suggested Dad understood exactly how much power information gave him and how quickly he moved when that power was threatened. The formal review lasted several days before the independent directors scheduled an emergency board meeting. Council circulated preliminary findings in advance, so nobody could claim the vote had been invented overnight. The meeting was properly called under the bylaws, and all 5 directors confirmed they would attend. I was not a director. I did not have a vote. That was another important line. My shares gave me rights. They did not give me the company. The night before the meeting, I received one text from Dad. "If you walk into that room tomorrow, you are choosing strangers over your family." I read it twice. A year earlier, maybe even a month earlier, that sentence might have made me defensive. I might have written 3 paragraphs explaining that I loved them, that I was not trying to hurt anyone, that family did not mean abandoning standards. Instead, I finally understood what he was asking. He wanted family to mean permission. Permission to decide what I needed. Permission to decide what I could own. Permission to decide what records counted. Permission to decide when the rules applied. I typed one sentence. No. I'm choosing rules over permission. Then I put my phone face down, because for the first time since the ivory box disappeared into Brittany's SUV, there was nothing left for me to investigate that night. The emergency board meeting started at 9 the next morning in the largest conference room at Whitmore Home Group's corporate office. By then, the outside review had been running long enough that nobody could honestly claim the meeting had been sprung on them because of something I had discovered the night before. Council had circulated preliminary findings. The directors had received notice under the bylaws. All 5 had confirmed attendance. My father was there because he was a director and CEO. Henry was there because he was a director. The 3 remaining seats belonged to people who had no reason to protect me personally, and, more importantly, no reason to protect Dad if the records did not support him. I was there because several of the issues began with my shareholder requests, and because the reviewers needed me available to confirm the timeline of what I had received and when I had received it. I did not have a board vote. I did not sit at the center of the table. I sat closer to council, with a folder in front of me, and no intention of turning the room into a family confrontation. Dad came in 3 minutes before the meeting began. He did not look at me. Mom arrived with him but was asked to wait outside until she was called, because part of the review involved decisions she had made in finance. Brittany had already been interviewed separately and was not permitted to sit through the entire board discussion either. That irritated Dad immediately. "This is a family company," he said to the outside attorney. "You're treating my wife and daughter like hostile witnesses." The attorney answered calmly. "We're separating people whose conduct is being reviewed so the board can hear the record clearly. They work here. Yes, they're family. That doesn't change the process." I watched Dad's face. That was the first collision of the morning between the world he had built and a system he could not redefine with one sentence. The independent director with the finance background, a man named Richard Collins, opened the meeting. He had served on the board for years but rarely involved himself in ordinary operations. Dad had once described him at dinner as useful because he knows when not to interfere. That description came back to me when Richard said, "The purpose today is not to decide whether family members helped one another. The purpose is to determine whether company assets, related party transactions, financial records, and management representations were handled in accordance with the company's obligations." Dad folded his hands. "I understand." He sounded as if he had been the one to write the sentence. The outside attorney began with the easiest category because, as she explained, a review had to separate bad optics from actual governance failures. The company vehicle assigned to Brittany came first. The benefit itself was permissible. There was a written compensation policy. There were records showing legitimate business use. There were also personal mileage issues that had not always been treated correctly. That required adjustment. It did not prove some grand scheme. I was glad they started there. It reminded everyone in the room, including me, that not everything I had questioned had turned out to be misconduct. The Arizona trip was similar. There had been supplier meetings. There had been a legitimate business purpose. Some personal expenses had been mixed into the trip and needed to be separated, but the trip itself was not fabricated. Dad looked at me for the first time. Not triumphantly, almost patiently, as if he wanted to say, "See? I did see. I had been wrong to treat every suspicious-looking item as equally serious." That did not make the rest disappear. The townhouse came next. The review confirmed there had been limited business use. A handful of designers and referral partners had visited. There were photographs and scheduling records. That part of the explanation was true. Then council moved to the funding. The company had paid for installation work and materials that remained permanently in Brittany's private residence. The records describing the arrangement had not clearly separated promotional benefit from personal benefit. There was no contemporaneous board approval for the extent of the personal value Brittany received. Several of the strongest supporting explanations appeared only after I started asking questions. Dad leaned forward. "We didn't need board approval for every marketing installation," Richard asked. "For every installation?" "No. For one in the private residence of your daughter, who was also a company executive?" Dad's jaw shifted. It was a company project. Then why wasn't the personal benefit disclosed? Because we weren't treating it as compensation. That isn't an answer. I said nothing. Dad looked at me anyway. He had spent years telling me that I turned everything into procedure. Now someone else was asking the same questions, and there was nothing personal about the tone. Dad tried a different approach. Whitmore has always operated with flexibility. We are not a public corporation with 10 layers of bureaucracy. We make decisions quickly. We use relationships. We trust people. Richard nodded. That may explain informality. It does. It does not explain inaccurate characterization. Dad's voice hardened slightly. Inaccurate according to whom? The outside attorney answered before Richard could, according to the underlying records. The next category was Northline Creative. This was where the room changed. Counsel did not describe Northline as fake. That mattered. The review confirmed the company had performed real work. There were legitimate deliverables. Some were useful. Some were mediocre. None of that was the central issue. The issue was the relationship. Northline's principal was Evan Mercer's brother. Brittany had been dating Evan when the vendor relationship began. Brittany had influence over brand spending. A conflict disclosure process existed. She had not completed it. Dad and Mom both knew about the relationship. The board had not been formally informed. One of the independent directors asked Dad, "Did you know Marcus Mercer was related to your daughter's boyfriend when Northline was approved?" Dad did not hesitate. "Yes." "Did you believe that created a conflict?" "No." "Why?" "Because Brittany wasn't married to Evan. She didn't own Northline. Evan didn't own Northline. Marcus did." The director asked, "So your position is that there was no disclosure obligation?" "My position is that there was no meaningful financial conflict." The attorney slid an email onto the screen at the end of the room. Dad's own words appeared in front of all of us. "If the work is good and the price is right, I don't care who they're dating." I had already seen it. Watching Dad see it in that room was different. He did not flinch. "That proves my point," he said. Richard looked at him. "It proves you knew the relationship existed." "I never denied knowing." The draft management statement says senior management was not aware of the full extent of Brittany's vendor relationships. Dad looked toward counsel. "That draft was never issued." "No," she said. "But it was prepared." "Prepared is not published." "Correct." The distinction was technically valid. It also did not help him much. Richard asked, "Who prepared it?" Dad said, "We were considering several possible responses depending on the findings." "Way?" "Management." "Which members of management?" Dad paused. That pause did more damage than a dramatic confession would have. The attorney moved on. Brittany was brought into the room next. I had not seen her since the night she sent me the draft statement. She looked tired, but not fragile. Brittany had always known how to put herself together when she expected people to watch her. Her hair was perfect. Her clothes were expensive. Her hands were shaking slightly when she sat down. Richard explained that the board wanted her answers on several narrow points. He asked whether she knew Northline was owned by Evan's brother. Yes. Whether she had completed the conflict disclosure. No. Why not? Brittany glanced at Dad. Dad stared at the table. She said, "I asked whether I needed to." "Who did you ask?" "My father." Dad looked up. Brittany continued. "He said if the work was legitimate, we didn't need to make it into something bigger than it was." Dad interrupted. "That is not what I said." Brittany turned toward him. "You said not to create unnecessary paperwork." "I said we didn't need to overcomplicate vendor selection." "That's the same thing." "No, it isn't." The room became painfully quiet. I had seen versions of that argument my entire life. Dad would make a broad statement. Someone else would act according to the obvious meaning. Later, if the result became inconvenient, Dad would narrow the language until responsibility belonged to the listener. Richard stopped them. "We are not resolving this by memory. We have the messages." Dad leaned back. Brittany looked relieved. Not because she was innocent, because for once she did not have to prove what her father had said by convincing people to believe her. The texts were displayed. Brittany asking whether she needed to formalize the conflict. Dad saying they should not create unnecessary paperwork if the vendor was delivering real value. It was not an explicit order to violate policy. It was also impossible to reconcile with Dad's suggestion that Brittany had independently handled Northline without management awareness. Richard asked Brittany about the townhouse. She admitted it was primarily her residence. She admitted Dad knew. She admitted Mom had helped classify several expenses. She also insisted some business meetings had occurred there. The review confirmed that. Again, nobody needed to exaggerate. The truth was damaging enough. Then Richard asked about the wedding registry. Dad immediately objected. That has nothing to do with this company. The attorney agreed in part. The personal property dispute is not a corporate offense and is not being presented as one. I appreciated that sentence more than anyone in the room knew. She continued. It is relevant only to the extent that certain communications establish timing and coordination among individuals whose statements about other events are being evaluated. It will not be used to convert a family disagreement into a governance violation. Dad looked irritated but had nowhere useful to take the objection. Brittany admitted creating the spreadsheet. She admitted Mom knew. She admitted I had never approved it. Then Richard asked the question I had wanted independently confirmed. Did your father know Susan intended to take the ivory box along with the other wedding gifts? Brittany looked at Dad again. This time he said, "Be careful." Richard's expression changed. "David." Dad lifted both hands slightly. "I'm telling her to answer accurately." Brittany swallowed. "Yes." Mom asked whether she should leave that one. Dad told her to take everything. Dad shook his head. "I told Susan not to create a scene at the wedding." "This was after the wedding," Brittany said. "It was the same situation." "No, it was at the house." Dad looked at her with an expression I recognized immediately. It was the look he used when someone stopped following the version of reality he had assigned them. Brittany saw it too. For years, that look had made her retreat. This time she did not. "He knew what Henry had done," she said. "He said if Lauren hadn't opened the box yet, he wanted a chance to talk to her first." Dad turned to the attorney. "This is irrelevant. To the corporate violations." "Largely, yes. To me, it answered the question I had carried since the driveway. They had not taken the certificate because they believed possession changed ownership. Dad had taken advantage of Mom's plan to redistribute the gifts because losing the ivory box inside that larger pile gave him time. The theft of everything had hidden the one item he actually cared about me not seeing. I did not react. At least, I do not think I did. The attorney moved the meeting back to corporate matters. Susan came in next. She looked at Brittany's empty chair before she sat down. Mom always read a room through relationships first. "Can we please stop treating this like we're criminals?" she asked. Nobody had called her one. The outside attorney said, "We're reviewing your role in financial classifications and subsequent document preparation." I organized records. After Lauren raised questions, "Yes, because she asked for more documentation. That can be legitimate." It was legitimate. Why were several new memos dated as though they had existed months earlier? Mom stiffened. They described decisions that had happened months earlier. That was not the question. Mom looked at Dad. He did not help her. The attorney displayed the forensic timeline. One memo bore a date from the previous year. The document system showed no version of it until after my request. The audit log showed its creation. A second version followed later. Then a message from Mom to Brittany. "Delete the old version from your side." Mom's face changed. "I meant the incorrect version." The attorney nodded. "That is possible." Mom seemed relieved too soon. Then, the next message appeared. "Dad said we only need the clean invoices if Lauren asks." The attorney said, "What did clean mean?" "Complete." "Why only if Lauren asked?" "Because Lauren was the one requesting them." "Why were the supporting memos made to appear contemporaneous, rather than labeled as later reconstructions?" Mom stared at the table. "I was protecting the company. By dating records incorrectly, I was making the files understandable." Richard asked, "Were you also protecting Brittany?" Mom turned toward him, as if the answer should have been obvious. "She's my daughter." "So is Lauren." The words were simple. Mom looked at me. For a second, the conference room disappeared. I saw her in the driveway. You always land on your feet, she said. Lauren wasn't the one in trouble. That was probably the clearest description of our family I had ever heard. I had not been in trouble. Therefore, it had been acceptable to create trouble for me. Richard did not pursue the emotional logic. He kept the discussion where it belonged. Your intent to help your daughter does not determine whether company records were accurately maintained. Mom nodded, but I could tell she still believed he was missing the point. The last major item was the proposed redemption. The outside reviewer put 2 forecasts on the screen. The one Dad had shown me. The one management had given the lender weeks earlier. They were not identical documents and had not been created for identical purposes. The reviewer said that clearly. Different valuations could use different scenarios. Different audiences could justify different assumptions. Then she showed the labels. The lender package described itself as the base management forecast. The redemption model used assumptions substantially more pessimistic than that base case. Richard asked Dad. Why? Dad answered immediately. Because a minority interest in a closely held company is less liquid and carries different risk. That explains a discount. Yes, it does not fully explain the operating assumptions. The company was facing uncertainty. The lender materials were prepared weeks earlier. Things change. What materially changed? Dad listed supplier concerns, financing pressure, market uncertainty, and the possibility of shareholder conflict. Some of it was legitimate. Then Richard asked the question I had been waiting to hear from someone other than me. Which version did you actually believe? Dad looked at him. Richard did not move. Was the lender forecast management's best view of the business? Or was the redemption forecast management's best view of the business? Both reflected different circumstances. That was not my question. Dad's eyes narrowed. You've been on this board long enough to know valuation isn't that simple. I do know that. I also know the more pessimistic model was prepared after Lauren became a shareholder and after she began asking questions. Dad glanced at me. There it is. Richard frowned. There, what is? This entire meeting, Lauren. Nobody answered. Dad pushed his chair back slightly. Henry gives her shares because he wants leverage. She arrives after 10 years and starts interrogating staff, pulling records, challenging transactions, accusing her mother and sister. And suddenly I'm the problem because I offered her a clean way out. I did not accuse every transaction, I said. It was the first time I had spoken in a while. Dad turned to me. You started this. No, I asked questions. You knew what those questions would do. I knew they might produce answers. You wanted this room. That was not entirely false. By then, some part of me had wanted the reckoning. I did not give him the easy denial. I wanted a review. You wanted to humiliate me. No. You want everyone here to hear you say I was wrong. He leaned forward. Go ahead, Lauren. Say what you came here to say. Every person in the room looked at me. Months earlier, I would have taken the invitation. I had rehearsed versions of that speech without admitting I was rehearsing them. I could have told him he had mistaken control for leadership. I could have told Mom that protecting one daughter by taking from another was not motherhood. I could have told Brittany she had finally discovered what favoritism cost when the person favoring her needed a shield. All of it would have been emotionally true. None of it was why the board was there. I looked at the documents on the screen. The records already say what matters. Dad stared at me. I turned to Richard. I'm not asking the board to punish my father for being my father. I'm asking you to decide what these findings require under the company's rules. Then I stopped talking. Dad looked almost disappointed. The outside attorney finished with the preliminary conclusions. Several expenses required correction rather than discipline. Some personal benefits needed proper treatment. Northline had performed legitimate work, but the conflict relationship had not been handled appropriately. The townhouse arrangement had mixed business and personal benefit without adequate contemporaneous disclosure. The most serious concern was not any single original transaction. It was the integrity of the later documentation and the attempt to present reconstructed support as though it had existed at the time. The draft statement regarding Brittany raised another problem because preserved records showed senior management had substantially more knowledge than the draft suggested. Dad still had explanations. Mom still had explanations. Brittany still had explanations. But for the first time, none of them controlled the room in which those explanations were being judged. The independent directors moved into closed session with counsel. Henry remained because he was a director, though Richard made clear he was expected to disclose his own prior concerns and his failure to push them further. Dad remained for the portions required by the bylaws and was excluded from others involving his own executive status. I waited outside for almost 2 hours. When the door finally opened, Richard looked exhausted. He did not announce a punishment. He told us the board had enough information to proceed to formal votes the following morning after council finalized the resolutions. Those votes would address Dad's executive authority and chairmanship, Mom's finance role and system access, Brittany's employment and vendor conflict, financial adjustments for improperly treated corporate benefits, and whether any findings needed referral outside the company. The board was not voting on our wedding gifts. That remained mine and Nathan's separate property dispute. I was grateful for the line. Dad walked past me without speaking. Henry followed several minutes later and only said, "Tomorrow." Then Mom came out. She followed me all the way to the elevator. "Lauren." I pressed the button. "Lauren, look at me." I did. Her face was pale with anger and fear. "Are you really going to let them do this to your father?" The elevator doors opened behind me. I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life telling me I was strong enough to absorb one more unfair thing. For once, the consequence in front of us did not belong to me, and I had no intention of picking it up for him. The board voted the next morning. By then, I had slept badly enough that I no longer had the energy to imagine dramatic outcomes. I drove to the corporate office expecting delay, compromise, maybe another round of explanations. Instead, the meeting was almost painfully procedural. Council read the proposed resolutions. The directors asked a few final questions. Dad challenged 2 phrases. Henry corrected 1 date in the record. Then Richard called for the first vote. Dad was removed as chief executive officer and stripped of day-to-day executive authority. 3 votes carried it. Henry voted yes. Both independent directors voted yes. Dad voted no. The 5th director abstained on the first motion because of the employee trust's position and then supported the management transition resolution that followed. Nobody gasped. Nobody applauded. A man who had run Whitmore Home Group for more than 30 years simply stopped being the person with the final operational say, because a majority of the board concluded that the failures were too serious to leave executive control. Unchanged, Dad remained a shareholder. He remained a director unless and until a separate process changed that. He still owned 38% of the company. He was not destitute. He was not dragged out by security. That mattered to me because I did not want a punishment that felt written for television. I wanted the consequence to fit what he had actually done. For my father, losing control was enough. The second vote removed him as board chair and authorized an interim management structure while the board searched for an outside professional executive. Dad stared at the table through most of it. When Richard asked whether he wanted his objection recorded, Dad said, "Record everything." The sentence sounded bitter in a room where records had become the reason he was losing power. Susan's consequences came next. She was removed from her finance controller role and from access to the company's accounting systems pending implementation of the board's corrective measures. The review did not treat every entry she had touched as dishonest. It did not need to. Enough had been established to show that she had participated in inappropriate classifications, created or helped create later supporting documentation that was not clearly identified as reconstructed, and allowed family considerations to interfere with financial controls. The company's outside accountant was directed to calculate the corporate adjustments that were actually supported by the evidence. Not every dollar Brittany had ever received. Not every expense Mom had approved. Only the amounts that could be identified and justified through the review. That distinction probably prevented the entire process from becoming vindictive. It also made the consequences harder for my parents to dismiss as persecution. Then came Brittany. Northline Creative's contract was terminated. The review had found an undisclosed conflict, weak approval controls, and enough unsupported or poorly supported work that the board no longer had confidence in the relationship. Brittany lost her vice president title. Her employment did not vanish because I demanded it. I had never demanded it. The board concluded that she could not remain in a senior executive position after failing to disclose the relationship, participating in questionable approval practices, and benefiting from a system she knew bypassed ordinary controls. Her cooperation during the review was noted. So was the fact that Northline had performed some real work. Those facts limited the narrative. They did not erase the consequences. Her company vehicle was recalled. Certain benefits were suspended. Amounts identified as personal rather than business expenses were referred for adjustment and repayment. She was offered the option of staying temporarily in a non-executive role while the company completed its transition, subject to stricter supervision and no vendor authority. She declined. That was Brittany. Losing the title mattered more to her than losing the paycheck. When she heard the decision, she looked at Dad before she looked at anyone else. He did not look back. For 1 second, I almost felt sorry for her. Then I remembered the registry spreadsheet. Feeling sorry for someone and rescuing them were not the same thing. That had taken me 39 years to learn. The resolutions also authorized counsel and the outside accountant to determine whether any findings required tax corrections or referral beyond the company. Nobody declared crimes from the conference table. Nobody called the police. Nobody predicted prison. The board corrected what it had authority to correct. Everything else would follow whatever process applied. When the meeting ended, Dad remained seated. Everyone else gathered papers. I stayed where I was because I did not want to look as if I had been waiting to watch him fall. Richard approached me first. You understand this doesn't solve everything. I do. The company still has a transition to manage. I know. You also understand your shares don't give you an executive position. I never thought they did. He studied me for a moment. Good. That was when Henry joined us. We need an interim committee for the executive search, he said, and eventually a permanent CEO. I knew what was coming before he said it. You should consider putting your name forward. No? Henry blinked. Richard looked more interested than surprised. You don't even want to hear what the role would involve? Henry asked. I know what the role involves. You know operations. You understand controls. You own 12%. And I have a career. This company is partly yours now. That doesn't mean I need to run it. Henry glanced toward Dad. After everything that happened, you could help fix it. That's exactly why I shouldn't take the job. He frowned. I explained it as simply as I could. If I become CEO now, Dad will spend the rest of his life saying this was a takeover. Brittany will say I wanted her position. Mom will say I destroyed the family because I wanted control. That doesn't mean they'd be right. No, but more importantly, I don't want the job. That seemed harder for Henry to understand. For too long, every conflict in our family had been about who got more. More attention, more help, more authority, more protection. My father had spent decades teaching everyone around him that control was the prize. I had no interest in proving I had beaten him by taking his chair. I want someone qualified who doesn't share our last name, I said. Richard smiled slightly. That was already my recommendation. Henry looked at me again, then nodded. All right. Dad heard enough of the conversation to speak from the other end of the table. You think an outsider will care about this company more than family? I turned toward him. I think caring and controlling turned out not to be the same thing. His face tightened. I did not wait for the argument. The company spent the next several days implementing what the board had decided. Dad's signing authority changed. System permissions were updated. Susan's accounting access was removed. Northline's contract was formally ended. The board brought in an experienced interim executive while beginning a search for permanent leadership. The world did not collapse. Payroll went out. The warehouse stayed open. Showrooms kept selling kitchens and bathrooms. Vendors kept delivering. That was probably one of the hardest parts for Dad. For years, he had framed himself as the person holding everything together. Then the company continued without him at the center. Diane called me that Friday. We got paid, she said. I heard. You sound disappointed. I'm devastated. She laughed. Then her voice became more serious. People are calmer. That matters. They're still talking. They'll stop eventually. Some of them are saying you're taking over. I'm not. I know that. Tell them the board is hiring professional management. I already did. I hesitated. Thank you, Diane said. Don't thank me yet. Outside management might decide half my processes are terrible. If they do, you'll make better ones. That, she said, is the Lauren I remember. After the corporate consequences became known inside the family, the second collapse began. This one had nothing to do with the board. Marissa forwarded me a message from another cousin asking whether Mom had really told relatives that I had agreed to give Brittany duplicate wedding gifts. I answered honestly. No, that was all. I did not send a manifesto. I did not post screenshots publicly. I did not create a group titled Things My Parents Lied About. I simply stopped protecting them from accurate questions. That turned out to be enough. Relatives began comparing their own messages. One aunt had been told I already owned everything on the registry and wanted Brittany to have anything practical. Another cousin had been told Nathan and I preferred cash, so household gifts could be redirected. Marissa had the spreadsheet Brittany sent before the wedding. Then another relative found a text from Mom sent several days before the ceremony. Don't buy her the kitchen set yet. Wait until after Saturday. Brittany may end up with the one already ordered. That message spread through the family chat quickly. It was not illegal. It was not corporate evidence. It was something more personally devastating for Mom. It proved she had planned before the wedding to treat our gifts as available inventory. Then Henry contributed one message of his own. Dad had texted him before the wedding, asking whether he had brought Lauren's package yet. Henry had answered yes. Dad had known the ivory box was coming. By then, nobody needed me to explain why the box mattered. The family had already watched Brittany post it. They knew Henry had transferred shares to me. They knew Dad had received corporate notice before the wedding. The pattern was obvious enough without me telling anyone what to think. Mom called me furious. You're letting them make us look like thieves. I'm answering questions. You know how people twist things. Are the screenshots fake? That isn't the point. It's the only point I'm interested in. We were trying to help Brittany. With my wedding registry? She had nothing. She had a townhouse full of furniture. You know what I mean. Yes, I do. That was the problem. I knew exactly what she meant. Brittany's discomfort counted as need. My boundaries counted as abundance. Mom lowered her voice. I never thought you'd turn everyone against us. I haven't told anyone to turn against you. You don't have to. You know what happens when you give people half the story. Then give them the other half. She went quiet. I continued, tell them I agreed. You know you didn't. Then tell them why you told them I did. She hung up. The strangest part was that nobody completely abandoned my parents. Family rarely works that cleanly. Some relatives defended them. A few said everyone had made mistakes. One uncle thought the wedding gifts were petty compared with what had happened at the company. Another aunt said I should forgive Mom because she was trying to keep both daughters afloat. But the automatic deference disappeared. That mattered. Mom had always been the person who organized birthdays, holiday dinners, family reunions, and group gifts. She controlled the logistics of belonging. For the first time, people stopped assuming she should. A cousin organized the next family barbecue without her. An aunt handled the collection for an older relative's anniversary. Nobody announced that Susan Whitmore was no longer family coordinator. They simply stopped giving her the role. Dad responded differently. He invited everyone to dinner. The message said he wanted to put the ugliness behind us and remember what family means. He chose a Sunday evening 2 weeks after the board vote. Nathan and I were invited. I declined. Not dramatically. I just wrote, "We won't be there." Mom called within 10 minutes. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. Your father is trying." "Trying what?" "To bring everyone together." "Has he apologized?" "You know he doesn't communicate the way you do." That wasn't my question. He lost enough. The sentence caught me. Lost enough. As if consequences were a quantity the family should ration once the person causing them became uncomfortable. I'm not asking him to lose anything else. Then come to dinner. No. Why? Because nothing has been resolved between us. Mom accused me of holding a grudge. I told her she was free to call it, whatever helped her understand the answer. On Sunday night, Marissa sent me a photograph. I had not asked for it. My parents' dining room table was set for 12. 4 people were sitting there. Dad, Mom, one older relative, one cousin who lived nearby and apparently felt too guilty to cancel. 8 empty chairs surrounded them. I looked at the picture longer than I should have. There was a time when seeing that would have made me feel victorious. It did not. It made me sad. Not sad enough to go. That distinction mattered too. Nathan saw the photo and set my phone face down. You okay? Yes. He waited. I smiled slightly. Mostly. That's probably more accurate. A few days later, Dad asked to meet me. We chose a neutral place. He looked different without the office around him. Not smaller exactly. Less reinforced. You refused the CEO role, he said. I was never offered it formally. Henry told me. Then Henry talks too much. Dad ignored that. Why? I don't want it. You expect me to believe that? Yes. You did all of this and you don't want control? I wanted information. You got me removed. The board removed you. Because of information you brought them. Yes. Same thing. No. He leaned back. You always did like technical distinctions. Some distinctions matter. He looked away. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he said, You got what you wanted. I could have fought him over that too. Instead, I asked, What do you think I wanted? My seat. No. To prove me wrong. Sometimes. That surprised him. I continued. I wanted you to stop deciding the rules changed when family was involved. He gave a tired laugh. You think companies run on rules? They run better when the rules still exist after the CEO's daughter walks into the room. His jaw tightened. There was my father again. But the anger passed more quickly than it used to. An outsider won't protect this company the way I did, he said. That may be true. He looked at me. I'm not asking the next CEO to love it. I'm asking them not to confuse loving it with owning everyone inside it. Dad did not answer. I left without an apology. That was fine. For most of my life, I had thought closure required the other person to understand exactly why they had hurt you. I no longer believed that. The last unresolved issue was embarrassingly ordinary compared with board votes and forensic reviews. Our wedding gifts. Nathan and I had already sent a separate written demand listing what we could document from photographs, registry records, gift cards, and relatives who confirmed what they had given. I kept it entirely outside the corporate dispute. Counsel helped only with the wording because I did not want Mom later claiming she had misunderstood what we were asking for. Return unopened items. Reimburse gift cards already used. Repay reasonable value for items sold, returned for store credit, damaged or otherwise no longer recoverable. Nothing punitive. Nothing theatrical. Just ours. Mom resisted for another week. Then Brittany agreed to cooperate. That changed the calculation. She had already lost her title, her company vehicle, and the Northline relationship. She no longer had Dad standing between her and every consequence. More importantly, I think she was tired of defending a pile of wedding gifts that had become evidence of how completely she had believed other people's property could become hers if Mom said so. We scheduled one meeting at my parents' house to go through the inventory. Susan sat at the kitchen table with the list in front of her. Brittany sat beside her. Dad did not join us. Nathan came because many of the gifts belonged to both of us. But he let me speak. Mom read through the first page with growing irritation. You're really going to make us account for every single thing? Yes. After everything that happened? Yes. You got the company. I looked at her. No, I didn't. You know what I mean. I actually don't. Your father is out. Brittany lost her job. I lost mine. People barely speak to us. Isn't that enough? Enough for what? For you to stop. I folded my hands. This is separate. It's all the same to you. No, that's why I kept it separate. She stared at me. I pushed the inventory slightly closer. The board handled company property. This is our property. Mom looked exhausted. Then she said, Fine. You won. What else do you want? I reached into my bag and took out the final inventory, the one Nathan and I had verified together. I placed it in front of her. Everything that was ours. Mom stared at the inventory, as if the pages themselves were insulting her. Nathan and I had kept the list simple. There were no emotional descriptions, no comments about what each gift meant, no column labeled betrayal. Item, giver, status, estimated value if the original could not be returned. That was all. I had learned by then that the cleaner the record, the less room my family had to turn my reaction into the issue. Brittany pulled the pages toward her and started reading. The espresso machine is still boxed. Then return it. The knives, too. Return them. She moved down the list. I used the restaurant gift card. Then reimburse it. Mom gave an exasperated laugh. You really need the money from a restaurant card? Nathan shifted beside me, but he did not answer for me. I appreciated that. This isn't a needs assessment, I said. You don't get to keep something because you've decided I can afford to lose it. We're talking about a gift card, Lauren. We started with a gift card. Then a mixer. Then cookware. Then everything else in Brittany's car. Every time I objected, you changed the question from whether it was ours to whether I needed it enough. Mom folded her arms. Because your sister did need things. I had heard the sentence so many times that it no longer made me angry immediately. That surprised me. A few weeks earlier, I would have felt my pulse jump before she reached the word sister. Now I mostly felt tired of the logic. Brittany kept reading. The betting is opened. Keep it and reimburse us. The lamps are still at my place. Return them. She made a note. For once, she was not arguing about whether she deserved them. Losing her job had not transformed her personality overnight, but it had done something more useful. It had made consequences real enough that she no longer assumed Dad or Mom would erase them before they reached her. Mom picked up the second page. Her finger stopped beside a line, a set of crystal glasses from my aunt. She already returned these. For store credit. So the credit wasn't hers. Mom pushed the page away. This is humiliating. I looked at her. For who? For all of us. No, Nathan and I are asking for our property back. That part isn't humiliating. You know what I mean. I did. She meant that it was humiliating to itemize what they had done. That distinction had protected my family for years. A behavior could continue indefinitely as long as nobody documented it clearly enough to make it look ugly, Brittany said quietly. I can pay that part back. Mom turned toward her. You don't have to take all of this on yourself. Brittany gave her a look I had never seen before. Mom, some of it is mine. The kitchen went silent. Not because the statement was dramatic, because it was new. Mom stared at her. We were all trying to help you. I know. You had just moved. I know. You were going through a terrible time. I know. Then stop talking like you did something awful. Brittany looked down at the inventory. I made the spreadsheet. Mom's mouth tightened. Brittany continued. I knew Lauren didn't agree. I thought she'd get mad and then get over it. I watched her carefully. That was not an apology. It was better than the excuses she had been giving me. I thought she'd complain, Brittany said, but I didn't think she'd actually make everyone give things back. I almost smiled. Why? I asked. She looked at me. Because you usually don't. There it was. Not cruelty. Expectation. She had spent so long seeing me absorb things that my refusal had felt less believable than her entitlement. Mom snapped. That's not fair. Brittany looked at her. It is. Susan's face changed. My mother had spent the entire dispute protecting Brittany from feeling too much responsibility. Now Brittany was volunteering for some of it, and Mom did not seem relieved. She seemed threatened. That told me something important. Mom had not only been rescuing Brittany because Brittany needed rescue. Mom needed to be the rescuer. Without that role, she had to look more directly at the damage caused by all those years of deciding who was strong enough to lose. We continued through the list. The practical items were easy. Some boxes were still unopened. Some had been opened but barely used. Some had been returned for credit. Several gift cards were gone. A few smaller items could not be located. We agreed on reasonable replacement values where the original gift could not be returned. Nathan had saved registry prices, but we did not demand full retail value when an item could be replaced for less. I did not want punishment hidden inside arithmetic. Then we reached the things with no meaningful resale value. Handwritten cards, custom pieces, personal gifts. That was where the conversation became harder. I pointed to the wooden recipe box. "Where is it?" Brittany frowned. "I think it's in my spare room." "You think?" "I didn't throw it away. You marked it donate." "I know." Mom sighed. "Lauren." She said she didn't know what it was. "That's the point." "Oh, please." I turned toward her. "No, Mom. This is the part you keep refusing to understand. If Brittany had taken a $500 appliance, you could keep telling yourself she needed something expensive that I didn't. That box wasn't expensive. It wasn't useful to her. She still believed she had the right to decide whether it stayed, went, or got donated. She made a mistake. She made a decision. There's a difference?" "Yes." I looked at Brittany. She did not defend herself. Mom did it for her. She was overwhelmed. I felt something in me finally give way, not in the violent way I had expected months earlier. It was quieter. I asked, "Did you ever ask if I was overwhelmed?" Mom blinked. "After the wedding," I continued, "did you ever ask whether I needed the gift cards? Whether Nathan and I had expenses? Whether the handmade things mattered to me? Whether I wanted to keep the cookware? Did you ask me anything before deciding Brittany needed all of it more?" Mom opened her mouth. Nothing came out. I waited. She looked down at the inventory. That silence answered more than any apology she could have constructed. For years, I had thought Mom had weighed both daughters' needs and simply favored Brittany's. She had not. There had been no weighing. Brittany's need entered the equation. Mine was assumed to be zero. "You always thought I'd be fine," I said. Mom's eyes filled, but I did not rush to comfort her. That was supposed to be a compliment. "I know. You were capable. I know. You didn't need us the way she did. That doesn't mean you were allowed to take from me." She looked at Brittany, then back at me. "I didn't think of it that way. I know that too." That was probably the worst part for her. I believed her. I did not think my mother had spent years waking up and deciding how to hurt me. She had simply built a moral system where Brittany's fragility created obligations for everyone else, and my competence erased obligations toward me. The fact that she had not intended cruelty did not make the system less cruel. We finished the inventory. Brittany agreed to return everything still recoverable within a week. She would reimburse the gift cards and the store credits over the next 2 months rather than all at once. Mom agreed to cover the items she had personally returned or redirected. Nathan and I accepted the timeline because it was practical, not because we were surrendering anything. Before we left, Mom asked, "What happens after this?" I knew what she meant. Us. Family. Birthdays. Calls. Christmas later that year. Whether there was some final payment that restored everything to its previous condition, I don't know yet. Her face tightened. "How can you not know?" "Because getting our things back doesn't undo the reason you took them. So what am I supposed to do?" "That part is yours." I stood. Mom looked almost offended. "You always have an answer." "Not for you." That was one of the first times in my life I had allowed another person to leave a conversation with a problem I could have helped solve. It felt strange. It also felt correct. Brittany contacted me 3 days later. Not about the gifts. She had moved out of the townhouse. That surprised me. The place had been one of the symbols of everything our parents had arranged around her. The location, the renovations, the company-paid improvements. The lifestyle she had been trying to maintain after her relationship with Evan became unstable. She had listed it for sale because the mortgage, taxes, and upkeep no longer made sense without the executive salary and company vehicle. "I found an apartment," she told me. "Okay." There was a pause. "That's all you're going to say?" "What do you want me to say?" "I don't know. That it sucks?" "It probably does." She laughed once. "You're terrible at this." "At what?" "Being sympathetic." "I'm being careful." "With me?" "Yes." That answer seemed to surprise her. She said, "I'm not asking you for money." "I didn't say you were. I know what you're thinking." "No, you don't." She was quiet. Then she said, "Fair." I asked where she had found the apartment. It was smaller, still in a good area, close enough to work opportunities, and expensive only in the normal way housing was expensive. For the first time since I could remember, Brittany had selected where to live based primarily on what she could afford rather than what our parents could help sustain. I have interviews, she said. Good. Not executive ones. Also probably good. She groaned. You couldn't resist. No. Another pause. Then she said, Dad isn't talking to me much. I knew that already. He had been furious that Brittany's cooperation had undercut his draft narrative. He had not cut her off entirely, but the relationship had changed. The golden child had discovered that favoritism came with terms she had never bothered to read. I'm sorry, I said. She sounded genuinely surprised. You are? Yes. You hate him. No. You got him removed. That still doesn't mean I want my sister to find out her father was willing to sacrifice her. Brittany did not speak for several seconds. Then she said, I thought he'd always protect me. I know. I thought you hated that. I did. Now he doesn't. And it doesn't feel like winning. No. She exhaled. Does anything feel like winning to you? I thought about it. Some things feel like being finished. She was quiet again. Then she said, I'm sorry about the recipe box. That was the first clean apology she had given me. No explanation. No, Mom said. No, you already have. No, I was going through a lot. Just the thing itself. Thank you. I found it. I didn't donate it. Good. I'll bring it with the other boxes. Okay. She hesitated. Are we ever going to be normal? I almost asked what she meant by normal. Then I realized I knew. No, I said. Not the old normal. That sounds bad. I think the old normal was bad. She laughed softly. Fair. I told her something I wanted clear before we got sentimental enough to make promises neither of us understood. If we have a relationship going forward, I'm not your backup plan. I know. No emergency rent because you chose something you can't afford. No calling me after Mom says I should help. No assuming my house, money, time, or things become family resources because you're in trouble. Her voice tightened slightly. I said I know. I need you to actually know. She waited. Then she said, Okay. That was enough for then. Henry came to see me the following week. By that point, Whitmore Home Group had an interim CEO who had already ordered a review of approval thresholds and conflict disclosures. Henry seemed energized by the changes in a way that annoyed me. You're enjoying this, I said. We were sitting on my back patio with coffee. Enjoying what? Someone else finally doing the governance work you avoided. He winced. Still angry? Yes. Fair. That was becoming a popular word in my family. Henry looked out across the yard. I should have confronted David years ago. Yes. I did confront him. You complained to him. That's not the same thing? You know it isn't. He nodded. I kept thinking he'd correct himself. Why? Because I knew the man he was when we started the company. I understood that more than I wanted to. My father had not always been the version I fought at the end. Henry had spent decades watching authority harden into identity. The more successful the company became, the easier it probably was to confuse past sacrifice with permanent entitlement. Henry continued. Every time I pushed too hard, he'd ask if I wanted to damage what we built. So I backed off. Then I told myself I was protecting employees. Protecting the company. Protecting the family. You were protecting yourself from a fight. Yes. I appreciated that he did not argue. He looked at me. Giving you the shares was partly another version of that. Yes. I'm sorry. I waited. He continued. I should have told you exactly what I suspected before the wedding. You should have had the choice to decide whether you wanted any part of it. That was the apology I needed from Henry. Not, I'm sorry your father behaved badly. Not, I'm sorry things got messy. He was apologizing for his own decision. Thank you. Do you regret keeping the shares? No. That answer came easily. I had thought about selling them once everything ended. Not to Dad. Not at his price. Just selling if a fair opportunity appeared and removing myself completely. I decided against it. Not because I wanted control. Because ownership no longer felt like an invitation back into my father's system. It was an asset. I could own it without working there. I could vote without running it. I could receive reports without treating every report like a family emergency. That separation had been impossible for Dad. I wanted to prove, mostly to myself, that it was possible for me. Good, Henry said. Don't sound so pleased. He laughed. A week later, the last wedding boxes arrived at our house. Brittany brought some herself. The rest were delivered because Mom said she did not want another face-to-face inventory session. Nathan and I checked them against the settlement list. Not because we were obsessed with proving a point anymore, because we had agreed to a process, and processes work better when you finish them. The mixer came back. The lamps. The knives. Several sets of towels. A stack of unopened registry boxes. The reimbursement schedule for the remaining gift cards had already begun. Near the bottom of the final carton, wrapped in a towel for protection, was the wooden recipe box. I lifted it out. The wood had a small scratch along one corner. That bothered me for exactly 3 seconds. Then I opened it. The cards were still inside. Claire's handwriting was on the first one. A recipe for the tomato sauce she had made every Sunday since college, followed by a note telling Nathan that if he ever claimed jarred sauce was just as good, he was not allowed to tell her. The next card was from my aunt, then a cousin, then one from Henry, then friends. Some recipes were serious. Some were jokes. Several were really just memories disguised as instructions. Nathan stood beside me, reading over my shoulder. This is the one you got mad about. Yes, you were already mad. This one made it worse. I can see why. I ran my thumb along the scratched corner. For most of the previous 2 months, every object that returned to me had entered a system. Photograph. Check the inventory. Mark returned. Record value. Save receipt. Close item. Competence had been useful. It had protected me. It had also become the armor Nathan had warned me about. I closed the recipe box. Then I carried it into the kitchen and set it on the shelf beside our cookbooks. No photo. No spreadsheet. No confirmation message. It was home. That was enough. By the time I am telling this, a few months have passed since the wedding. Whitmore Home Group is still operating. The stores did not collapse because Dad stopped running them. The interim executive stabilized operations while the board searched for permanent leadership. Some controls changed. Some people hated the changes. Diane told me warehouse staff complained for about a week, and then discovered most of their jobs were exactly the same. Dad still owns his shares. So does Henry. So do I. Dad does not control daily operations anymore, and he is no longer board chair. I see him occasionally. Our conversations are shorter than they used to be, and more careful. He has never given me the apology I once thought I needed. I stopped waiting for it. Mom no longer has access to the company's finances. Her relationship with the extended family is slowly changing, though she is no longer automatically the person everyone lets organize everything. She still believes some of what happened to her was excessive. She also returned the last amount she owed us under the wedding gift settlement. Both things can be true. Brittany moved into the apartment she told me about and eventually accepted a job with a smaller home design company. It did not come with a vice president title. It did not come with a vehicle. She had to explain the gap and the circumstances around leaving Whitmore. I never called anyone for her. She got the job herself. We speak occasionally. I do not trust her the way I once thought sisters were supposed to trust each other automatically. Trust is no longer something I give because of a label. She is rebuilding it in smaller pieces. Nathan and I have rules now that would have sounded ridiculous to me before the wedding because I would have assumed families should not need them. My parents do not have keys to our house. Nobody handles our packages. Nobody speaks for me to relatives. Nobody moves our property for convenience. Nobody makes financial decisions on our behalf. If Mom calls and says Brittany needs something, I ask whether Brittany has called me herself. If the answer is no, the conversation ends there. I used to think boundaries were what you built after someone stopped loving you correctly. Now I think they are how you find out whether a relationship can exist without control. The strangest part is that I do not feel triumphant most days. I expected revenge to feel louder. I thought I would replay the board vote. Dad losing the chair. Mom losing access. Brittany losing the title. Sometimes I remember those things. But the moment that stays with me is smaller. My mother sitting at that kitchen table after I asked whether she had ever asked what I needed. She had no answer. For most of my life, I interpreted my independence as proof that I had escaped the family pattern. I had not. I had simply become the person who could survive it most efficiently. That was why everyone kept using me as the shock absorber. I could recover. I could earn more. I could solve it. I could land on my feet. They had mistaken resilience for consent. For years, so had I. The night the final boxes came home, Nathan went upstairs before me. I stayed in the kitchen for a few minutes. The house was quiet. The recipe box sat on the shelf exactly where I had placed it. I could see the scratch on one corner from across the room. I thought about taking it down and fixing it, sanding the mark, matching the stain, making it look untouched. Then I smiled at myself. Not everything needed to be restored to prove it mattered. I left the scratch. I turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs. The box stayed where I had chosen to put it. For once, I did not need a photograph, a ledger, a witness, or anyone's permission to prove that it belonged to me. When people keep taking from you because you're the strong one, strength should not become permission to ignore your boundaries. Ask clearly, document what matters, and stop confusing forgiveness with surrender. You can care about family without funding their choices or absorbing their consequences. Protect what is yours. Choose accountability over revenge, and walk away from control disguised as love. Subscribe for more stories about boundaries, courage, and consequences earned.